Hi guys, tonight we begin a journey, a gentle, quiet journey through the life of a man born under shadow, destined for greatness, yet cloaked in mystery. This is the entire story of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, a tale of love, loss, exile and kingship, a tale whispered in halls of elves, sung by rangers under starlight, and written in the old scrolls of Middle-earth. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the stillness of the night carry you into the story of a man born to become more than a legend. Our story begins long ago, in a time when the world felt older and quieter, not ancient yet, but slowly passing into shadow. Aragorn was born in the twilight of a fading age, in the year 2931 of the Third Age. But before we come to his birth, we must go further back, far back, to understand the world he was born into and the legacy that lived within his blood. You see, Aragorn was a descendant of kings. His line stretched unbroken to Elendil the Tall, and further still to the ancient realm of Númenor, the island kingdom of men blessed with long life and wisdom. Yet that kingdom fell, consumed by pride, and from its ruins came the faithful few, Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, who founded the kingdoms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. It was Isildur who cut the ring of power from the hand of Sauron, the Dark Lord, in a desperate act of valor, and it was Isildur who failed to destroy it, claiming it instead for himself. That moment would shape the fate of Middle-earth and all who lived after. Isildur's line, noble though it was, became a line of chieftains rather than kings, as the kingdom of Arnor broke and withered through war and sorrow. Many years passed. Arnor fractured into smaller realms, Arthedain, Cardel and Rudor, and one by one they fell. The Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul, broke the last kingdom in the north. Yet the line of Isildur endured, hidden, safeguarded by a secretive order, the Dunedain Rangers. Tall, grim-eyed men who wandered the wild, protecting those who no longer knew their name. Among them, Arathorn, son of Arador, rose as chieftain. He was quiet, noble and brave. He fell in love with Gilrain, a woman of proud but cautious heart. Their love, though shadowed by war and danger, bore fruit. A child, a son, Aragorn. He was born in Rivendell, the hidden refuge of the elves, nestled in the cleft of the mountains where the Brunnen flows. Elrond, the Lord of Rivendell, received the child and his mother with solemn grace. But even as Aragorn drew his first breath, sorrow came. Arathorn was slain by orcs during a skirmish near the Angle. Gilrain, newly widowed, brought her son to Elrond, seeking safety beyond what her people could offer. Elrond, who had seen many ages pass, understood the weight this child would carry. The shadow of the past lay heavy on his brow. He named the child Estelle, meaning hope, and kept his true heritage secret. For in that time, the servants of Sauron still hunted the line of Isildur, fearing a rightful heir might one day arise. Aragorn grew in Rivendell, surrounded by beauty, knowledge, and quiet sadness. Elves, fair and immortal, watched over him. The songs of the First Age echoed through the halls, and stories of old, of Beren and Luthien, of Gondolin and the fall of Númenor, became his lullabies. Estelle wandered among the libraries and forests, unaware of the legacy that pulsed within his veins. He was taught to speak many tongues, the noble speech of the elves, the harsh tones of the dwarves, and the softer dialects of men. He was skilled with bow and sword, but more importantly, he learned wisdom and mercy. Elrond raised him not merely to be strong, but to understand that strength must serve goodness. As he grew into a young man, Estelle felt the restlessness of the world stir in his blood. He would walk for hours among the birches and pines beyond the borders of Rivendell, feeling something calling beyond the horizon. He did not yet know what it was, but it whispered to him, as the wind whispers through the leaves at dusk. Then, one day, when he was 20 years old, the truth was revealed. Elrond summoned him to the Hall of Fire, where shadows flickered and silence held sway. There, before the flickering flame, Elrond told him of his true name, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur. With those words, a great weight descended. Aragorn felt pride and fear intermingle as the world shifted beneath his feet. Elrond gave him heirlooms long kept in secret, the ring of Barahir, a token of the ancient kings, the shards of Narsil, the sword that had broken beneath Elendil when he fell, and a memory, the memory of a lineage lost, yet not forgotten. He stood in silence for a long time that night, gazing at the stars above Rivendell, wondering what lay before him. From that moment onward, he was no longer merely Estelle. he was Aragorn. Soon after, he wandered alone into the wild. For the next many years, Aragorn chose exile, walking the lands in shadow. He joined the Rangers of the North, though he rarely gave his name. Among them, he was known as Strider, or simply the Dunedain, the man of the West. He fought in forgotten wars, travelled through lands most men feared, and learned the bitter loneliness of those who must bear a crown not yet theirs. But it was also in those years that he met someone who would change the course of his heart forever. Her name was Arwen Undomiel, daughter of Elrond, the Evenstar of her people. But that is a story for another night. Now let your mind drift with the wind through the trees of Rivendell. Imagine a young boy chasing leaves beneath golden boughs, his laughter echoing in halls built before time. Imagine hope, hidden away yet alive, and sleep. Many years had passed in Rivendell before Aragorn laid eyes on her. Arwen, daughter of Elrond, whose beauty was whispered of in quiet songs, even among the elves. It was not by design that they met, but as many things in Middle-earth, it happened as if shaped by a thread of fate, softly spun in the quiet corners of time. Aragorn had returned to Rivendell after a long journey into the northern wilds. His cloak was weathered, his boots worn, and his gaze older than his years. He had tasted the bitterness of solitude and the burden of lineage, yet the refuge of Rivendell still wrapped around him like a memory, soothing and familiar. Elrond welcomed him back with a solemn grace, and the halls opened once more to their wandering son. He wandered beneath the trees one evening, his mind occupied by thoughts he could not yet name, when he heard a voice, soft as starlight, singing in the tongue of the Eldar. It was a song of Luthien, the elven maiden who once chose mortality for love. The words curled through the glade like mist, and he followed them as if in a dream. There she was, Arwen Undomiel, the Evenstar of her people. She stood among the birches, her dark hair falling like a veil over a silver-grey dress. Her eyes held the depth of ages, and her voice, still resonant in the air, seemed to hold the memory of moonlight and lost things. Aragorn stood motionless. He thought in that moment that he had stepped into legend. She was not merely beautiful, she was timeless. And something stirred within him, something he had never known but had always awaited. Arwen turned and looked upon him, and for a moment the world grew still. Their first words were quiet, uncertain. Arwen, though aged in elvish years, was still young among her kind, over 2,000 years old, but still filled with curiosity and kindness. She had lived in Lothlorien for many years, far from Rivendell, and her return was unannounced. Aragorn marvelled at her, yet tried to mask his wonder. In his heart he was still Estelle, hopeful but uncertain. What could a mortal man offer someone so radiant, so eternal? But Arwen saw more than lineage and appearances. She saw the shadow in his eyes and the courage behind it. She listened to him speak, not as a king-to-be, but as a man who carried great burdens with humility. Days passed, then weeks. They walked together beneath starlight, sat in silence by the waters of the Breenan, and shared stories of old. Aragorn spoke of his travels, of lonely battles and strange lands. Arwen spoke of Lothlorien, of Galadriel her grandmother, and the light that lingered beneath golden leaves, even in the heart of winter. The tale of Beren and Luthien came up again and again in their talks. It was more than a song, it was a memory, a shadow they walked alongside. For Beren, a mortal man, had loved Luthien, an elven maiden, and she had chosen a mortal life for him. Their love defied fate and endured beyond death, a story etched into the very fabric of the world. Aragorn would look at Arwen and feel a longing he could not speak aloud. He dared not. He was of noble blood, yes, but of a broken line, a chieftain among wanderers. Arwen was daughter to one of the greatest lords of the age. To love her was to court heartbreak. But love does not ask permission. It blooms in silence, grows in shadows, and reveals itself in the gentlest of moments. It was on a morning draped in mist that Aragorn gave voice to the feeling he had long held. They stood on the hill of Serin Amroth, deep in Lothlorien, where time moved more slowly, and the heart could hear its own beating. He spoke to her plainly, with no ornament of words. "I love you," he said, "and I would walk all paths in darkness, so long as you were with me at the end of them." Arwen said nothing at first. The breeze moved her hair like water, and she looked out across the forest. "You are mortal," she said softly, almost to herself, "and I will remain when you are gone. I will bear that loss for eternity." But then she turned to him, and her eyes held no fear. "I choose a mortal life." In that moment, time itself held its breath. She had spoken words no elf would speak lightly. For her, it was a decision that meant the severing of her immortal bond, a sundering from her people at the end of her days. When she passed, she would not sail west to the undying lands. Her soul would walk the path of men beyond the circles of the world where no elf could follow. On that hill, beneath silver leaves and the scent of Eleanor and Nifredil, they made a vow. Not in loud declaration, but in the quiet understanding of hearts bound together. It was not a wedding. Not yet. It was something older, something sacred. Elrond knew. When Aragorn returned to Rivendell, Elrond looked upon him with great sorrow and great pride. "You love my daughter," he said, his voice low with centuries of knowing, "and she loves you. But there is a price." Aragorn bowed his head. He knew what was to come. "Then you must rise to be more than a ranger, more than a chieftain. You must become who you were born to be. Only when you have claimed your throne and united the kingdoms of men shall I give her hand." It was a task that would demand everything, for the kingdoms were broken. Gondor stood alone, and Arnor had faded into legend. The enemy stirred in the east. War, darkness, and ruin loomed like thunderclouds. And yet Aragorn accepted. He turned from Rivendell and walked again into the wild. But this time his steps were different. He was no longer a wanderer avoiding his fate. He was a man walking toward it. Through deserts, over mountains, into the halls of kings, and under the shadow of towers, Aragorn would wander. Few knew his name. Fewer still knew his purpose. He served in secret, fought in silence, and prepared for a world that did not yet know it needed him. He became Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, serving the steward of Gondor. He rode with the Rohirrim. He hunted the servants of Sauron far into the east and south, into lands forgotten by most men. Arwen remained in Lothlorien, patient and steady. She did not waver. She waited with the grace of her people, watching the stars and singing songs of twilight, and in those long years their love did not fade. It grew, quietly, strongly, like roots beneath the snow. Years passed, slow and steady, like rivers carving canyons over time. The world moved and the shadows grew, but Aragorn remained faithful to the path placed before him. He was not yet the king he was destined to be. He did not yet carry a crown, but he bore the weight of that crown every day, quietly, in lands far from thrones and cities. During these long years of exile, Aragorn took many names. To the people of Gondor, he was Thorongil, Eagle of the Star, a name that blended elvish heritage with the sharp clarity of the Dunedain. He appeared in Gondor during a time of uncertainty, offering his service to steward Ecthelion II, the father of Denethor. He wore no heraldry and bore no title, save for what his deeds earned him. Ecthelion welcomed him, for Thorongil was valiant, learned, and wise beyond his apparent years. He rode into battle beside the captains of Gondor, offering counsel in times of peace and fire in times of war. Under his leadership, the watch along the Anduin grew stronger. Rumours spread among the soldiers. Some said he was of noble blood, others that he had come from the west with elvish blessing. But none knew his true name. It was during these years that Aragorn earned the deep respect of the men of Gondor. He commanded not with pride, but with calm assurance. He spent little time in the White City, preferring to ride along the borders, to keep watch where the enemy might stir. But even among allies, there were tensions. Denethor, the steward's son, watched Thorongil with guarded eyes. He sensed something hidden behind the ranger's quiet demeanour. Denethor was proud, sharp of mind, and heir to a long line of stewards who ruled Gondor in the absence of a king. Though Thorongil never claimed lordship or sought power, Denethor grew wary of him. He feared what this mysterious outsider might one day become. Aragorn felt the weight of this unspoken rivalry and knew that he must soon leave. Before departing, he accomplished one last task, a daring raid upon the port city of Umbar, long held by the Corsairs, enemies of Gondor. In the dark of night, Thorongil led a fleet south, striking swiftly. The harbour was set ablaze, the ships of war destroyed. He slew the captain of the Corsairs with his own hand. The people of Gondor rejoiced, for a great threat had been cast down. But Thorongil did not return to Minas Tirith. He left quietly without farewell and vanished into the east. Whispers followed in his wake. Some believed he had returned to the west. Others said he had died, but those closest to him knew the truth. He had other roads to walk, far from thrones and banners. From Gondor, Aragorn journeyed to Rohan, the land of horse lords. There he rode with the Rohirrim as a companion, not as a commander. He earned their trust through action, not word. The men of Rohan respected strength, loyalty, and courage, qualities Aragorn carried like second skin. He rode beside kings and slept beneath open skies. In the golden hall of Meduseld he was welcomed by kings, though he never wore a crown. From Rohan he wandered further still, into the forgotten lands east of the misty mountains. Into Harad, where the sun burns red and the stars are foreign. There he learned the tongues of distant peoples and fought against the creeping influence of Sauron, whose whispers stirred even in those distant deserts. He travelled beyond maps, into Rhûn, into the east where the stars felt dimmer and old powers lingered. Few tales are told of these years, for he spoke little of them, even to Elrond. But it is said that Aragorn uncovered many secrets, of the Dark Lord's movements, of ancient places long abandoned, and of the despair that grew in hidden corners of the world. These were not years of glory. They were years of shadows, of long silence, of lonely choices, and quiet victories that would never be sung. Yet through it all, Aragorn remained steadfast. He wrote often to Elrond, though his messages were brief. His heart carried Arwen's image, and it was that image which gave him strength when the weight of his destiny became too heavy to bear alone. Back in the north, the rangers of the Dunedain guarded the borders of the Shire and the wild lands. They too were few, remnants of a fallen kingdom. Aragorn would return to them from time to time, unseen and unheralded, offering news or guidance, then vanishing again like mist. And in the halls of Rivendell, Arwen waited. Elrond watched her with a father's grief, knowing that her choice, once made, could not be undone. She grew quieter over the years, her laughter softening, her songs more distant. But her love did not falter. When Aragorn returned briefly to Rivendell in secret, Elrond told him again, in quiet but clear words, "You cannot claim her until the shadow is lifted and your throne is restored." Aragorn bowed his head in acceptance, though his heart ached. He did not press the matter, for he knew the depth of Elrond's sorrow and the gravity of Arwen's choice. So he left again, into shadow, into exile. But the winds of the world were shifting. Sauron had returned, though few dared say his name aloud. The necromancer of Dol Guldur, once thought vanquished, had revealed his true identity. The Dark Lord stirred again in Mordor, gathering strength behind the walls of Barad-dûr. Armies were mustering, fear whispered in every corner of Middle-earth. And far to the west, in the peaceful Shire, a small, unassuming hobbit carried a secret. A ring that once belonged to Sauron himself. The time for hiding was coming to an end. For Aragorn, the road of shadows would soon open into a path of fire and fate. The choices he made in silence, the friendships forged in obscurity, and the battles fought in distant lands, all would converge. And the name he had kept hidden would become the rallying cry of a world on the edge of ruin. But for now he walked on, quietly, faithfully, through the wild. In the northern lands of Middle-earth, the wind was sharper, the trees taller, and the stars felt closer, as if old friends watching from afar. Aragorn, now well into his 40s, though he appeared scarcely older than 30, continued his long vigil in the wild. Time passed differently for him than for other men. His Númenórean blood gave him long years, but not a life without weariness. He returned often to the lands near the Shire, though he did not enter its borders. His watch was silent. He moved unseen, a shadow among shadows. Few hobbits ever glimpsed him, and those who did thought him no more than a vagabond or wandering hunter. They gave him names, Strider, Longshanks, and the like, but did not know the heart that beat beneath the weathered cloak. Aragorn had grown quieter with the years, his voice deep and thoughtful, his presence calm but commanding. He was never truly alone. His fellow rangers of the north kept vigil with him, watching the borders of the Shire and Eriador. The Dunedain were few, their numbers dwindling with each passing generation, but their loyalty was unwavering. They called him chieftain, though no ceremony ever crowned him. Under his leadership, the Rangers protected the free peoples from threats they would never know had existed. Bands of orcs still crept down from the misty mountains. Trolls stirred in the dark corners of the world. Wolves roamed in greater numbers, and strange whispers came from the ruins of Angmar. Yet these dangers were kept at bay, not by armies or walls, but by silent men in the trees, cloaked in grey and guided by hope. It was during this time that Aragorn became a true master of the wild. He could track a footprint across stone, hear whispers in the wind, and speak the tongues of birds and beasts in ways that seemed uncanny. His knowledge of herb lore and healing grew deep. Many wounds that would have killed other men he could mend with poultices and quiet hands. He learned the ways of the wood from the elves and the songs of the stones from the dwarves. His heart remained ever tied to Arwen, though they saw each other but rarely. On clear nights he would gaze toward the east, toward Lothlorien, and remember the starlit vow made beneath silver leaves. That memory warmed him when the world felt cold. But the peace, such as it was, could not last. Signs began to stir, signs that the darkness was not sleeping. Whispers came from the south. Black riders, cloaked in shadow, were seen crossing the borders of Mordor. Orcs grew bolder, attacking settlements with strange coordination. The sky at dawn sometimes blushed red, as if the sun bled from some unseen wound. And then came word that Gandalf the Grey had returned to the west. Gandalf, the wandering wizard, had long been a friend to Aragorn. Their paths had crossed many times in the past, and a deep trust had grown between them. Gandalf, though shrouded in mystery, saw clearly into hearts. He understood the world in ways that few others did. He spoke in riddles, but his actions were never without purpose. The wizard came to Aragorn with news that changed everything. "There is a ring," Gandalf said, "a ring of power, the One Ring." At first, Aragorn could hardly believe it. The ring, lost for thousands of years, had passed into myth. But Gandalf had tracked it, followed its whispers through time and shadow, and now believed it lay in the hands of a hobbit. Bilbo Baggins. The old hobbit of Bag End, whom Aragorn had once heard tales of, had carried the ring unknowingly since his adventures in the Misty Mountains. Now it had passed to his heir, Frodo. Gandalf spoke of the urgency. The ring could not remain in the Shire. Sauron sought it. His gaze, though far, could stretch even into the quiet hills of Hobbit lands. The riders were already moving, dark, terrible servants of the enemy. So Aragorn made ready. He returned to Bree, the small village at the edge of the Shire, where men and hobbits mingled in the common room of the Prancing Pony. There he waited, watching, listening, for Frodo Baggins. He took up once more the name of Strider, the weather-worn ranger known to few and trusted by fewer. It was in Bree that the hobbits arrived. 4 of them, Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin, stumbled into the inn, wet from rain, cloaked in uncertainty. They were far from home, and danger nipped at their heels. Aragorn watched them from the shadows, noting Frodo's cautious glance and Sam's suspicious stare. When he approached them, he did so with quiet intensity. "I can protect you," he said, "but I must know you trust me." Frodo hesitated. Sam bristled, but there was something in Strider's eyes, a deep weariness, yes, but also honesty. He knew the roads they would travel. He knew the darkness that followed them. And so they agreed, albeit with wary hearts. That night, the Black Riders came. They slipped into Bree like fog, their presence unnatural and cold. In the rooms where the hobbits were supposed to sleep, they struck, but found only empty beds, thanks to Aragorn's foresight. He had hidden the hobbits away, kept them close, and watched the shadows with sword in hand. From that moment forward, he was no longer just their guide. He became their protector. They fled into the wild, into the vast and unfamiliar lands between Bree and Rivendell. Aragorn moved with confidence, guiding them through tangled woods and over treacherous hills. He hunted for food, sang old songs to keep their spirits from failing, and taught them what he could of survival. Yet the riders were relentless. 9 of them, bound to the will of Sauron, neither living nor dead. They could smell the ring. They were drawn to it like wolves to blood. And Frodo, burdened with it, began to feel its weight, not only on his shoulders but in his mind and soul. At Weathertop, they found Aragorn's limits tested. There on the bare hill beneath the stars, the riders attacked. 5 of them, cloaked in terror, struck as night fell. Frodo, overwhelmed, tried to resist. He drew the ring, put it on, and in that moment saw the world as it was to them, a realm of shadows and fire. One of the Nazgûl stabbed him with a cursed blade. Aragorn fought back with fire and fury, driving them off, but the wound was deep. not just in flesh but in spirit. Frodo's strength waned, the wound would draw him closer to shadow with each passing hour. Aragorn knew there was only one hope. They had to reach Rivendell. They had to reach Elrond. The days that followed Weathertop were long and perilous, wrapped in silence and shadow. Frodo, pale and feverish, rode weakly on the back of Aragorn's arm-guided pony. The wound dealt by the Witch King was not of ordinary steel. It was a Morgul blade, forged in the depths of evil, designed not just to maim, but to claim. A shard of it remained buried in Frodo's flesh, inching slowly toward his heart. Should it reach its mark, he would become a wraith, a servant of the Nine, a hollow echo of himself. Aragorn felt the urgency pressing like a storm on his back. The ring-wraiths, having tasted blood, would not be far behind. He moved with swiftness, but every path seemed to narrow beneath unseen eyes. The lands around them were no longer safe. He tended to Frodo with all the skill he had learned in years of wandering. At Amon Sul, just after the attack, he had found Athalas Kingsfoil, an herb long known to the Dunedain for its healing qualities. He crushed its leaves into water and bathed Frodo's wound, easing the pain, though he could not halt the slow poison. The scent of the herb filled the air, clean, bright and ancient, like memory returned. The other hobbits watched with growing fear. Sam rarely left Frodo's side, his face drawn tight with worry, while Merry and Pippin did their best to keep spirits lifted, though the weight of their danger had settled in. Aragorn guided them through deep valleys and hidden ways, avoiding the open road. The weather turned colder, mist clung to the hills, and a haunting stillness blanketed the woods. At night, Aragorn kept watch by the fire, sword across his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by distant cries, some beastly, some altogether unnatural. They crossed the last bridge over the Bruinen, which gleamed silver in the pale autumn light. There, Aragorn found a beryl stone placed upon the bridge's edge, green as new leaves. It was a sign from the elves of Rivendell. The road ahead was not yet taken by the enemy, but the riders would not be delayed long. Aragorn urged the company forward, but Frodo's strength was fading. His skin grew cold, his breath shallow. He spoke little, and when he did, it was of strange things, whispers and shadows, cold hands and fireless eyes. The wound was drawing him toward the realm of wraiths. They reached the edge of the troll shores, where ancient stone forms, giants frozen in battle, loomed like watchers from a forgotten war. Aragorn paused only briefly to recall Bilbo's tales of his journey with Thorin Oakenshield, who had passed this very way decades before. But there was no time for stories now. At last, a sound in the woods. Hooves. But not of the enemy. From the trees rode Glorfindel. Yes, an elf lord of great power and old lineage. His hair shone like sunlight through gold, and his presence cast off shadow. He had been sent by Elrond, foreseeing that the riders would hunt along the eastern road. His horse, Asphalloth, swift and light of foot, carried with it the strength of the Eldar. Aragorn stepped back, allowing Glorfindel to examine Frodo. The elf's expression was grave. "We must reach the ford," Glorfindel said. "There is no other hope." They made haste, placing Frodo upon Asphalloth's back and urging him forward. Aragorn and the others followed behind on foot. The ring-wraiths had sensed the movement. A cry broke across the sky. High, terrible, a blade of sound that cut into the bones of the earth. Black shapes emerged from the trees behind them, galloping in dreadful silence. Frodo, clutching the reins, barely conscious, rode ahead. The ford of Bruinen appeared as a ribbon of silver threading between steep banks. Asphalloth, untouched by fear, surged into the water. The nine followed. They rode into the shallows, their dark cloaks soaked, their hands stretched out like claws. They called to Frodo, not with words, but with power. They commanded him to stop, to come to them, to surrender. Frodo turned, his voice trembled. He raised his hand. "You shall have neither the ring nor me." Then the river rose. From the heights of Rivendell, Elrond had summoned the waters of the Bruinen. The river surged like a living wall, white and thunderous. Among the waves danced shapes, horses of foam and cresting spray, rearing and crashing down upon the riders. The Nazgul, caught in midstream, were swept away by the fury of the flood. Their shrieks pierced the air as they were cast into the churning current. Frodo collapsed upon the riverbank. The others reached him moments later. Aragorn fell to his knees beside the hobbit, his face tight with worry. Frodo's skin was pale as snow, his eyes closed. "Will he live?" Sam asked, breathless. Aragorn said nothing. Glorfindel lifted Frodo gently. "We must get him to Elrond." And so they passed through the hidden valley of Rivendell. The air changed. It grew warmer, touched by distant music and golden light. The trees whispered in tongues older than time. The burden of the road lightened with each step. They reached the house of Elrond. It stood not like a fortress, but like a poem made stone, graceful arches, silver fountains, and halls where memory lingered like perfume. Elrond himself received them, his gaze serene yet piercing. He bore the wisdom of the First Age, and his hands were skilled in arts long forgotten by mortal men. Frodo was carried away, and Aragorn remained outside the healing chamber, pacing like a shadow in the corridor. Hours passed, then a day, then more. At last Elrond emerged. "He will live." Aragorn exhaled, long and deep. He said nothing more, but his shoulders dropped slightly, as if a great weight had eased. The first battle had passed, but the war lay ahead. Soon others began to arrive in Rivendell, elves from the woodlands, dwarves from Erebor, and men from distant corners of the world. Gandalf returned as well, robed in grey, his staff in hand, and his eyes filled with the storms of knowledge. The ring had revealed itself. The time of hidden things was ending. And Aragorn? He stood in the Hall of Fire once more, surrounded by the ancient songs of his youth. The stars glittered through tall windows, and he waited for the council that would shape the fate of Middle-earth. In the heart of Rivendell, as autumn's golden leaves drifted silently down from ancient trees, a moment of deep stillness settled across the valley. The wounded hobbit slept in peace, guarded by Elrond's care, while his companions wandered the tranquil halls, touched by the ageless calm of that place. But beneath the serenity, the currents of the world moved swiftly. Sauron had stirred, the ring had surfaced, and so the time had come for decisions to be made. Elrond summoned a council. It was not a gathering of ceremony or tradition, but of purpose, a gathering of those who, though scattered by distance and race, shared a stake in the fate of all free peoples. From every corner of Middle-earth they came. Elves, dwarves, men and halflings, kings and warriors, emissaries and wanderers. They came not as rulers, but as voices. Aragorn stood quietly near the edge of the chamber, his cloak still travel-worn, his boots stained with the dust of long roads. He spoke little, observing those who gathered. He watched Gimli, son of Gloin, proud and sturdy as stone. He watched Legolas Greenleaf, fair and swift-eyed, a prince of the woodland realm. He watched Boromir, the son of the steward of Gondor, strong of arm and firm of will. And he watched the hobbits, Frodo, still pale but resolute, Samwise, faithful and ever near, Merry and Pippin, curious and restless. And then the council began. Elrond spoke first, his voice calm but clear, laying bare the truth. The Ring of Power had returned. Forged in secret by Sauron, lost in the river Anduin, passed through many hands until it came to Bilbo Baggins and now to Frodo. The One Ring, the master of all others, and the key to the Dark Lord's dominion. Gandalf then rose and recounted a tale darker still. He told of his long search, of his imprisonment by Saruman the White, who had turned traitor and sought the ring for himself. The wizard's voice grew fierce as he described the evil of Barad-dûr, the growing armies of Mordor, and the inevitable ruin that would fall should the ring remain. Arguments rose like a wave. Some urged the ring be used against the enemy. Boromir, son of Denethor, pleaded that it be wielded by the wise to defend Gondor and strike back against Sauron. "Why should we not use this weapon?" he asked, his voice heavy with the desperation of a kingdom long embattled. "Let us use the power of the enemy against him." But Elrond shook his head, so did Gandalf, and Aragorn stepped forward. "The ring answers to one master," he said. "It has no other loyalty." Boromir turned his gaze to Aragorn then, sharp and appraising. "And who are you to speak for such things? You are no king of Gondor." The room quieted. Aragorn did not raise his voice. He did not boast or deflect. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn," he said, "and if by life or death I can save Gondor, I will." Boromir blinked, taken aback, but he said no more. Elrond nodded solemnly. "He is Isildur's heir," he said, "and the rightful king." A weight shifted in the room. Some eyes looked at Aragorn with newfound curiosity, others with uncertainty, but he did not dwell on it. He knew well that a crown claimed by blood was not enough. It must be earned in deed. The question still remained. What must be done with the ring? The answer was bitter but clear. It could not be used. It could not be hidden. It could not be given to another. It must be destroyed. And the only place it could be unmade was in the fire that forged it, Mount Doom, in the very heart of Mordor. A hush settled. The task seemed impossible. To walk into the land of shadow to the foot of the Dark Tower, carrying the weapon of the enemy itself. No army could march unseen. No great hero could overcome the darkness alone. Then softly Frodo spoke. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." Aragorn's breath caught. For all the weight the moment held, it was not shouted or adorned. Frodo's voice trembled, but he stood tall. A small figure, but not a small heart. Elrond looked upon him with deep understanding. "You shall not go alone." And so the fellowship was formed. 9 companions, Frodo, bearer of the ring, Sam, who would not be parted from him, Merry and Pippin, whose loyalty ran deeper than fear, Gandalf the Grey, the guide and wise counsellor, Legolas, the keen-eyed elven archer, Gimli, stout-hearted dwarf of Erebor, Boromir of Gondor, driven by duty and pride, and Aragorn, son of Arathorn, who would walk once more into shadow for the sake of a world that did not yet know him. They would leave in secret, travelling light and swift across mountain, forest and plain. The enemy would seek them, but not all eyes would see where they passed. The time for war had not yet come. The time for silence, stealth and sacrifice had begun. Aragorn stood that night at the edge of a terrace, looking out at the stars above the valley. Behind him, the halls of Rivendell glowed with soft light. Before him lay the wilderness, unforgiving, uncertain, and vast. He felt the weight of the journey settle onto his shoulders. He had fought many battles, wandered far and wide, worn many names. But this task was different. It was not about reclaiming a throne. It was about protecting a spark of hope in the smallest hands. He heard quiet footsteps. It was Frodo. The hobbit looked up at him, weary but determined. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked. Aragorn knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on Frodo's shoulder. "There is hope," he said, "and sometimes that is enough." In the days that followed, they gathered supplies, sharpened blades, and bound their fates together. There were no banners, no horns, no speeches, only quiet glances, tightened belts, and final goodbyes. When at last they left Rivendell, it was into the pale light of morning, with the cold wind at their backs. The ring-bearer walked at the front. The fellowship followed, and Aragorn walked at his side. The fellowship departed from Rivendell in the hush of winter's breath, slipping between the bare trees and out into a world slowly falling under shadow. Their steps were soft, deliberate, without fanfare. The strength of their mission lay in secrecy. 9 companions, different in blood, history, and heart, bound together by purpose alone. Among them, Aragorn moved with quiet vigilance, his senses honed by decades of wandering, always attuned to threat and trail. They followed the course of the Brunnen eastward at first, passing through rolling hills blanketed in frost. The hobbits marvelled at the changing lands, sometimes wide-eyed, sometimes weary. Gandalf guided the path by counsel, and Aragorn by foot. He scouted ahead in silence, returning each evening with news of paths clear or troubled. He never wasted a word, and yet each gesture reassured the company more than long speeches ever could. Despite the chill, the journey began well. The land, though vast, was still under the waning watch of Rivendell's protection. Birds still sang. The sky was still open. But as they crossed into the wilds of Hollin, the air changed. It was subtle at first, the absence of birdsong, the stillness of the trees, the way the wind whispered not through leaves but across stone. Aragorn's brow furrowed more each day. He knelt often, studying the ground. Shadows passed in his expression that he did not voice aloud. One evening, as the company sat beside a low fire, he turned to Gandalf and spoke softly. "We are being watched." Legolas's ears had already caught the absence of woodland sounds. Gimli's hand rarely left the haft of his axe, but it was Aragorn who confirmed what they had all begun to sense. Eyes followed them, not beast, not bird, but something else, something unseen. "Crebain from Dunland," Gandalf muttered grimly. "Spies of Saruman." So Saruman was already upon their trail. The road to Mordor, never simple, had grown treacherous. The company shifted course. They debated their route. To the east lay the Gap of Rohan, open, exposed and likely watched. To the north the Redhorn Gate, Caradhras, the cruel mountain. The pass was dangerous, but it offered the best chance of stealth. Aragorn was hesitant, but deferred to Gandalf's judgment. They turned toward the mountains. The climb began. Caradhras rose before them like a wall, its slopes white with snow, its crown lost in cloud. The wind howled not with nature's voice, but with malice. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then relentless. The path narrowed, the rocks became treacherous. They moved slowly, each footstep a battle. Aragorn had supported Frodo through the deeper snowdrifts, shielding him from wind with his own cloak. He bore the burden of the journey without complaint, lifting others when they faltered. When Boromir struggled forward with the hobbits on his back, Aragorn did the same. The two men, once wary of each other, now moved side by side through the storm. But the mountain did not relent. Whether it was the work of nature, or the will of Sauron, or even Saruman, none could say. What mattered was that Caradhras had chosen to deny them passage. An avalanche forced them back. They were driven down from the heights, battered and freezing, and into a choice none wished to face. There remained only one path, the mines of Moria. Aragorn's face darkened at the name. He had passed the gates before, long ago, but never entered. None who knew the dwarves' legends took the word lightly. Moria was vast, ancient, and shrouded in darkness. The dwarves had delved too greedily and too deep, and what they awoke in the dark was still whispered of with dread. "I do not wish to go that way," Aragorn said. "The memory of evil lives there." But they had no choice. The gate was hidden beside a still lake, smooth and black. The moon rose as they arrived, casting silver light on the water. Gandalf sought the door with elvish words, while the others rested. Aragorn walked the perimeter, ever watchful. Something in the lake stirred his unease, and then the gate opened. The company stepped inside. Darkness fell upon them like a cloak. The passage swallowed the sound of their feet. The walls pressed in with ancient weight. Moria was a city of the dead, once the proud home of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, now a tomb. Their footsteps echoed through great halls and winding tunnels. The grandeur of the dwarves was still evident in the stonework, but decay clung to every surface. Aragorn moved near the front, helping Gandalf navigate the maze of passages, guiding the others with a torch in one hand and his sword in the other. It was Gimli who held the most hope, searching for signs of his kin, but Aragorn knew the signs already: scratches on the walls, bones where none should lie, silence where there should have been song. Then came the tomb. Balin, Lord of Moria, Gimli's kinsman, had perished years ago, along with his folk. The fellowship stood in silence around the stone sarcophagus. The grief in Gimli's eyes cut deeper than any blade. It was there, in the chamber of the dead, that the enemy found them. A careless movement by Pippin awakened something in the dark, a sound like drums, echoing from the deep. Orcs came first, shrieking and fast. Aragorn fought at Frodo's side, cutting through the creatures with the fury of a man who had spent his life in shadow. His sword was swift, his shield unyielding. Yet it was not the orcs that chilled his blood. It was what followed. The Balrog. Fire and shadow, older than the mountains themselves, wrapped in flame and hatred. Gandalf stood before it on the narrow bridge of Khazad-dûm, staff in one hand, sword in the other. "You cannot pass," he said, and Aragorn for once did not stand at the front. He knew. This was not a battle of men. Gandalf fell. The bridge cracked. The wizard vanished into shadow, the Balrog dragging him down into the chasm. A scream broke from Frodo. The fellowship staggered. "Fly, you fools!" Gandalf had cried, and they ran. They fled through the final halls of Moria, blind with grief and shock. Aragorn was the last to leave, holding the rear, sword drawn, unwilling to abandon Gandalf even as the walls of the mountain shook behind him. But there was nothing more they could do. Outside, daylight returned, but it was cold comfort. They stood in a world now changed. Aragorn knelt in the grass, looking back at the gates of Moria. Then he stood. "We must move," he said. For now he was the leader, and the weight of the fellowship rested on his shoulders. The days following their escape from Moria were veiled in grief. The sky above them was clear, yet the weight of Gandalf's absence made the world feel dimmer. Each member of the fellowship moved in silence, as though any word spoken aloud might break the fragile veil that held their sorrow in check. Aragorn bore the burden most of all. He had always deferred to Gandalf in matters of counsel. The wizard had been their guide, their light in shadow, not the keeper of lore and hope. Now that light was extinguished, at least to their eyes, and in its place stood a hollow space only leadership could fill. Aragorn did not hesitate. He rose from mourning and took command with quiet determination. He did not claim the role. He accepted it as one might a burden placed gently in their hands. There was no speech, no declaration, only a shift in the air, a silent understanding. Their next destination was Lothlorien, the Golden Wood. A place spoken of in elven song and mortal rumour, where time passed strangely and the trees whispered in ancient tongues. Aragorn knew the way, having passed near its borders in his earlier journeys, but he had never walked under its golden canopy. Few mortals did, and fewer still were welcomed. As they approached, the land began to change. The air grew lighter, touched by unseen music. Even the wounded hearts of the Fellowship began to ease as the trees of Lorien stretched their golden limbs above them. But before they could rest, there was a final trial. At the borders of the forest they were met by sentinels, elves of the Galadrim, silent and watchful, arrows drawn but not loosed. Legolas stepped forward and spoke in the elven tongue. The elves listened, their eyes resting longest on Aragorn. They knew him, not as Strider, not as a ranger of the north, but as Estelle, the foster son of Elrond, a man whose destiny reached back into the folds of time. To the Galadrim, he was no stranger. Haldir, their guide, looked upon Aragorn with measured reverence. "Long has it been since a son of the West has walked this path," he said, "and long have we watched for your coming." The Fellowship was allowed to enter. They crossed the Silverlode and stepped into a dream. The forest of Lothlorien was unlike any place in Middle-earth. It shimmered with quiet magic. The leaves of the Malorn trees glowed gold even in winter. Light filtered down in soft strands, catching in the hobbit's curls and glinting off Gimli's axe. Time seemed to slow, or perhaps it stretched. Each hour felt endless and yet fleeting. They were brought to the heart of the forest, to the high city of Caras Galadhon, where two figures awaited them beneath the stars. Galadriel and Celeborn, the lady and lord of Lothlorien. Celeborn welcomed them in courteous speech, but it was Galadriel who held their gaze. Her eyes, clear as starlight and older than mountains, passed over each of them. She saw not only their forms, but their hearts, and when her eyes met Aragorn's, she saw the fullness of his burden. "Long have you wandered," she said, "and long have you hidden your name, but the time of hiding ends." Aragorn bowed his head. "I know it," he said quietly. Galadriel walked slowly to Frodo and spoke to him in private, and though the others did not hear her words, they felt the trembling of something ancient pass through the leaves. In the days that followed, the Fellowship rested. The wounds of Moria began to heal, at least those of the body. Frodo grew stronger. The hobbits found comfort in the songs of the elves. Even Gimli, whose people held long bitterness toward the elves, found awe in the beauty of the forest and a growing, quiet respect for Galadriel. Aragorn did not rest. He walked the golden paths alone, often pausing beneath the Malorn trees to listen. His thoughts were heavy with doubt. He questioned every decision, his silence in Moria, his delay at the tomb, his inability to save Gandalf. The crown he did not wear felt heavier than ever. One evening, as twilight fell and the sky turned lavender, Galadriel found him standing by a silver pool. She spoke no words at first, only stood beside him. "I fear I will fail them," he said after a long silence. Galadriel looked upon him with a faint smile. "Even the wisest cannot see all ends, but you are not meant to see. You are meant to choose." He turned to her, eyes shadowed with grief. "I am not the king Gondor needs." "You are more than a king," she replied. "You are hope, clothed in mortal skin." Then she handed him something, an ornate sheath, wrought of silver and grey leather set with a white jewel. It was made for a sword, not yet whole. "Should you reclaim your birthright," she said, "this will hold it." Aragorn accepted it in silence. Soon the time came to leave Lothlorien. Galadriel offered them gifts. To Frodo, a light that would shine in dark places. To Sam, a box of earth from her garden. To Gimli, a strand of her golden hair. And to Aragorn, a green stone set in a silver brooch. The Elfstone, once given to him by Arwen, now blessed by Galadriel. With boats gifted by the elves, the Fellowship took to the river Anduin. The current carried them south, through lands quiet but watchful. The river shimmered under starlight, but all knew the ease would not last. The Fellowship was not only being followed, it was beginning to fray. Boromir, strong and noble, had grown restless. He looked often at Frodo and the ring, with eyes clouded by conflict. Aragorn saw it. He said nothing, but the tension did not escape him. The weight of the ring was pressing on them all. Still, Aragorn remained near Frodo, guiding the boats, sharing quiet words when the night grew long. He did not lecture. He did not warn. He simply stayed. For Aragorn understood what it meant to bear a burden alone, and he would not let Frodo carry it without someone watching the road beside him. The river Anduin flowed steadily south, its grey waters catching the light of the sun by day and the stars by night, carrying the Fellowship deeper into lands shadowed by fear and secrecy. Each bend in the river revealed a new stretch of forest, a new outcropping of stone, and sometimes the flicker of unseen movement beyond the banks. Though no blade had yet been drawn, Aragorn felt it clearly. Danger crept closer with each league. The boats skimmed along the water like whispers, guided by the practiced arms of Legolas and Aragorn. The company had grown quieter, more inward. Frodo sat near the prow of his boat, gazing often toward the distant hills, his face drawn and silent. The ring was heavy on his neck now, even if it weighed nothing in the hand. Boromir, too, had changed. He lingered near Frodo more often, offering protection, but his eyes grew more clouded, as though he warred within himself. Aragorn watched it all. He said little, but he did not sleep deeply. Each night, when the others settled by the fire or wrapped themselves in cloaks for rest, Aragorn remained awake longer than most. He would sit with his back to a tree, sword across his knees, ears straining for the sound of a snapped twig or the sigh of an arrow loosed. He knew that the choices ahead would not be simple. He knew that soon leadership would no longer mean direction. It would mean division. They passed the Argonath, two great statues carved into the rock, kings of old, standing watch over the river, their arms raised in eternal warning. As the boats drifted beneath their towering forms, Aragorn was silent, but something in his bearing shifted. He sat taller, straighter. The others noticed, but said nothing. In that moment, something ancient stirred in him, something that reached beyond memory. Isildur and Anarion, sons of Elendil, builders of Gondor, ancestors of Aragorn. As the shadows of the great kings passed over them, the Ranger of the North became for a moment something more. The river knew, the stone knew. They camped that night at Parth Galen, a green slope beside the shores of Nen Hithol. The great falls of Rauros thundered in the distance. Mist rose from the southern horizon, curling like breath from some sleeping giant. The morning would bring decisions. The Fellowship had reached a turning point, and the road ahead was no longer one. To the west lay Minas Tirith and the realm of Gondor. To the east, Mordor. That night, Aragorn sat apart from the others. His eyes scanned the waterline between the stars, but his thoughts were with Frodo. He knew the burden the hobbit carried, and he had seen the strain in the ring-bearer's eyes, and he had seen something else, Boromir's growing desperation. He approached Frodo the next morning quietly. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Frodo hesitated. "Yes," he said, "more than I have ever been." Aragorn nodded. "That is no failure. Only the brave feel fear and walk forward still." Frodo gave him a small, sad smile. "And what path would you have me take?" Aragorn looked toward the east, where Mordor lay cloaked in smoke and ruin. "I would have you choose your own road," he said, "and know that whatever path you take, I will do all in my power to guard it." Then he left him to think. The company was meant to decide together, but before they could, the breaking began. Boromir vanished from sight. Frodo too. The company searched, calling names into the trees. Aragorn's heart raced. He feared the worst. Then, at last, he found Boromir stumbling back into the clearing, breathless, his eyes wide with pain, not from injury but from something deeper. "I tried to take it from him," Boromir said, his voice trembling. "The ring. I could not stop myself." Aragorn's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He placed a hand on Boromir's shoulder. The man collapsed to his knees. "He's gone," he whispered. "Frodo's gone." Aragorn turned without hesitation. He ran through the trees, fast as a deer, heart pounding. He called Frodo's name. He searched the slope, the banks, the underbrush, but Frodo had vanished. Then he heard the cries, not of Frodo, of battle. He turned and raced back through the woods. A band of Uruk-hai had descended upon the Fellowship. Tall, brutal, and bred for war, they moved with purpose and coordination. Aragorn arrived to find Boromir standing alone, already bloodied, defending the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, with desperate strength. Arrows flew. Boromir fell to his knees. Aragorn roared, sword drawn. He charged into the fray, blade flashing. He felled one, then another. Beside him, Legolas loosed arrow after arrow, and Gimli's axe bit deep into flesh and bone. But the hobbits were taken, carried off, and Boromir had fallen. Aragorn knelt beside him. The warrior was pale, but his eyes still burned. "I tried to take the ring from him," he said again. "I know," Aragorn whispered. "I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king." Aragorn gripped his hand. "You did not fail." Boromir breathed his last with those words, and the forest fell silent once more. They laid him to rest in one of the boats, his sword on his chest, and sent him over the falls of Rauros into the rushing waters as a warrior of Gondor. Then came the choice. Frodo was gone, Sam too. Merry and Pippin had been taken. The fellowship was broken. Legolas turned to Aragorn. "What now?" Aragorn did not pause long. The grief was there, but so was the fire. "We follow the orcs," he said. "Merry and Pippin must be saved." "And Frodo?" Gimli asked. "He has chosen his road," Aragorn said quietly, "and I do not think we could have guided it better." He turned to the east for a moment, toward Mordor, then back to the west. "Let's hunt some orc." And with that, the ranger who had walked in shadow became a commander of light, not crowned, not yet, but already a king in heart. The forest of Parth Galen faded behind them as Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli surged forward, tracking the orcs with relentless focus. They ran across open plains, through thick grass and wind-worn ridges, hearts burning with urgency. Merry and Pippin were alive. Aragorn believed it with a conviction that felt carved into his bones. As long as breath remained in them, they would not be abandoned. Aragorn led the pursuit. He moved with the instinct of a hunter and the desperation of a man who had lost too many already. He read signs in crushed grass and broken branches that others would not have noticed. Orc tracks, deep and wide, the presence of smaller prints, stumbling, hobbit feet, bound and struggling. At times he would pause, kneel and run his fingers across the earth, eyes narrowed in concentration. Then, wordlessly, he would rise and move on, the others following in his wake. They crossed Rohan, a land of sweeping grasslands, golden hills and scattered woods, the Riddermark, realm of horse lords. The wind there carried the scent of distant fires and thundered like galloping hooves. Aragorn felt both welcome and warning in it. Rohan was not yet their enemy, but they were trespassers in a land torn by growing unease. For 3 days and nights they chased the orcs without pause. Sleep came only in fleeting moments beneath trees. Food was scarce. The rhythm of their pursuit became something primal. Run, breathe, scan, run again. Gimli, though short-legged, never faltered. Legolas moved lightly, never weary. Aragorn pressed forward, always one step ahead, guided not just by skill but by an invisible tether of hope. Then, one morning, they crested a hill and found a field strewn with bodies. Dead orcs. Slaughtered, scattered like discarded armour. Aragorn swept the field, heart-pounding. Were the hobbits among them? Had they been slain? But no, there were no hobbit forms, no small bones, only the corpses of Uruk-hai, their black armour stained with dust and blood. Among them, signs of a different hand, arrows fletched with the feathers of Rohan. Riders had been here, a new direction. Aragorn turned eastward, eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, rising like a silent sentinel, stood the forest of Fangorn, dark, ancient and secret. He felt a shift in the air. Something stirred there. The orcs had come close to its borders. Before they could move further, a group of riders surrounded them. Horsemen of Rohan, led by Éomer, Marshal of the Mark. He was tall and golden-haired, stern of face, and his hand did not stray far from the hilt of his sword. The Rohirrim had suffered much. Saruman's orcs raided their villages, and trust in strangers had withered like frost-bitten wheat. Éomer looked upon Aragorn and his companions with suspicion. "You follow orcs across our land," he said, "but you bear no token of friendship and speak with accents not of the mark." Aragorn met his gaze calmly. "We are hunting friends, taken by the orcs you slew." Éomer's eyes narrowed. "Then you are too late. None escaped. We left none alive." Aragorn did not flinch. "You left none, yet I say 2 were not there. We will find them, dead or alive." Then he spoke his true name. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn. If by life or death I can save them, I will." The riders stirred. Something in Aragorn's bearing shifted the wind. He no longer looked like a ragged traveller. He stood straight, tall, cloaked in quiet authority. Éomer gave them horses. He could not spare men, but he gave them speed. And with it Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli rode to the borders of Fangorn. They dismounted before the dark eaves of the forest. Its trees loomed high, ancient and still. A silence deeper than any they had known blanketed the ground beneath the leaves. Fangorn was older than the kingdoms of men, older even than many of the elves. Here, the forest remembered. They entered cautiously. The trees closed around them like slow waves. Branches twisted high above, the canopy thick with green shadow. No birds sang. Every step seemed to echo, though no sound followed. Aragorn felt the weight of time pressing in on all sides. They searched. Signs were faint. A hobbit's brooch here, trampled ground there. But no blood, no bodies. Legolas turned to the trees often, as if trying to hear whispers in a language he had almost forgotten. Then they met him. Not an orc, not a hobbit, but a man. A grey-cloaked figure standing tall upon a mossy rise, staff in hand, eyes shadowed by the brim of his hood. Aragorn stepped forward cautiously, heart thudding. "Who are you?" The figure did not answer. Gimli raised his axe. Then the figure lowered his hood. It was Gandalf, but not as they had known him. His robes were no longer grey, but white, radiant, glimmering with power, withheld behind gentle eyes. His staff was new, gleaming like moonlight captured in wood. His voice, when it came, was deeper, fuller, and yet somehow softer. "I am Gandalf," he said, "though that name now is but a shadow of what I was." He had fallen in Moria, yes, but not to death as men know it. He had passed through fire and shadow, through battle with the Balrog that shattered stone and time. He had died and been sent back. A new purpose, a deeper mission. "I return to you now," he said at the turn of the tide. The three companions stared in wonder. Gimli muttered to himself in disbelief. Legolas bowed low. Aragorn said nothing at first. Then he stepped forward and clasped Gandalf's arm. "We are needed," Gandalf said. "The world changes. Saruman moves. War is upon Rohan, and Theoden is not himself." "And the hobbits?" Aragorn asked. Gandalf smiled. "They are safe, for now, in the care of a shepherd of trees." Then he turned his eyes toward the plains. "To Edoras," he said, "we ride." And so, with swift steeds and an old friend newly reborn, Aragorn once again took to the road. The wind of the world was shifting. Storms gathered over the mountains and fire stirred in the east, but the light had returned, if only briefly. And with it, hope. They rode through the plains of Rohan as dawn broke over the ridges, gilding the tall grasses in gold and bronze. Shadow still clung to the east, but the sky behind them was clear, touched with the clean light of a rising sun. Gandalf rode at the front upon Shadowfax, the lord of horses, silver and swift, barely touching the earth as he ran. Aragorn followed closely behind, astride the mount gifted to him by Éomer, his eyes always scanning the horizon. They made for Edoras, the seat of the King of Rohan. It stood on a high hill, a city of timber and stone, surrounded by the wide seas of grass that rolled in every direction. Medisild, the golden hall, shone like a crown at the summit, its roof adorned with horse-shaped carvings that caught the sunlight as they approached. Aragorn had seen many halls in his travels, elven towers, dwarven fortresses, even the scattered ruins of Númenórean watchposts. But Medisild stood differently, proud, weather-beaten and brave. It was a place of warriors, songs, and long memory. As they neared the gates, a challenge rang out. The guards were wary. No stranger was welcomed lightly in those days. Saruman's spies walked in many forms, and Rohan was no longer a land of simple peace. At first, they were denied entry. Aragorn watched Gandalf step forward and parley with calm authority. The guards faltered, hesitant before the white-cloaked figure. Still, the name of Mithrandir stirred unease. Rumours of wizards and manipulation had already poisoned the court. Gandalf did not press. Instead, he gave his name plainly and awaited their decision. At last, they were allowed inside, but only under the condition that Gandalf relinquish his staff. He did not. Aragorn felt the tension rise. He said nothing, but his hand hovered near the hilt of his sword. The guards bristled, but Gandalf's voice, low and commanding, carried with it the weight of a deeper power. "I will speak with your king," he said, "as I am, unhindered." The gates opened. They climbed the long stairway to Medisild. Along the way, Aragorn observed the city. Women and children huddled near fires, Warriors sharpened weapons, but their eyes were dim with doubt. Rohan was rotting from within, not from war alone, but from despair. At the doors of the hall, Éowyn awaited them. She was clad in mail beneath a white dress, golden-haired and resolute. Aragorn's eyes met hers briefly, and in that look something passed between them, recognition not of love, but of shared burden. She did not smile, but she nodded. Inside, the hall was dim. King Theoden sat upon his throne like a shadow of himself. His eyes were clouded, his skin pale, and his voice barely more than a whisper. Beside him, slouched and snake-like, stood Grima Wormtongue, advisor in name, but jailer in truth. Aragorn stepped forward only when Gandalf did, standing at his side like a pillar. The confrontation was swift. Grima attempted to dismiss them, his words laced with poison, but Gandalf silenced him with a single command. He stepped toward Theoden and, raising his staff, cast off the spell that had gripped the king like a chain. Light filled the hall. Theoden blinked as if waking from a dream. His posture straightened. The years seemed to fall away from him like a cloak of dust. When he rose from the throne, he looked like a king again, grizzled but proud, with fire behind his eyes. Grima fled. Theoden, with trembling hands, lifted his sword Herogrim from the wall. Aragorn watched in silence as the king reclaimed his strength, not with pride, but with quiet awe. This was not a moment of glory. It was a moment of restoration, of a man regaining himself after years of slow erasure. That evening, Aragorn stood with Éomer on the steps of Meduseld, watching the sun fall beyond the mountains. Éomer spoke of the battles they had fought, of the men they had lost. He asked Aragorn of Gondor, and Aragorn said only, "It will not stand alone." Preparations for war began at once. Scouts were sent, horns were tested, old armor was unearthed. Theoden made the difficult choice to lead his people to Helm's Deep, a fortress in the mountains, strong and defensible, where they could withstand the storm that approached. For Saruman's wrath was coming. He had bred an army not just of orcs, but of Uruk-hai, stronger, faster, crueler. Tens of thousands, armed and driven, marching from Isengard with a single purpose, to break Rohan. The journey to Helm's Deep began under grey skies. The refugees, old men, women, children, moved slowly under the protection of the king's riders. Aragorn rode often at the rear, watching for any sign of pursuit. His sword was never far from hand, and his eyes never left the horizon. It was during this journey that his bond with Éowyn deepened. She spoke with him at night, by the fire, asking not of his title, but of his life, his choices, his solitude, his purpose. Aragorn answered gently but carefully. She admired his strength, his kindness, and something in her eyes began to change. But Aragorn saw it, and sorrow stirred in him. His heart, though heavy with duty, was already spoken for. Still, he treated her with warmth and respect. One evening she offered him a cup of mead and asked, "Do you not fear death?" Aragorn looked into the flames. "I have lived in its shadow all my life," he said. "But fear, no. I fear failure. I fear not being enough." She said nothing more, but her gaze lingered long after. Then came the warg attack. As the company moved through a mountain pass, they were ambushed by wolves ridden by orcs, beasts twisted for battle, all teeth and malice. Chaos erupted. Screams echoed between the hills. Riders were thrown, blades flashed, hooves pounded. Aragorn fought without hesitation, leaping from his horse and meeting the enemy head-on. He moved like a man in his element, striking with precision and fury. But in the frenzy, he was thrown from a cliff, vanishing into the river below. They thought him dead. Éowyn wept, but he lived. He awoke upon the riverbank, bruised and blooded, and staggered to his feet. A horse, white and loyal, awaited him. Brego, the steed he had calmed in the stables days before. Together they galloped toward Helm's Deep, toward war, toward the night that would test the heart of every man. The wind howled as Aragorn rode hard across the plains, Brego's hooves pounding the earth like a war drum. Rain streaked from the sky in cold sheets, and the mountains loomed ahead like jagged sentinels. Helm's Deep waited, nestled in the ravines of the White Mountains, a bastion of ancient stone, hewn by long-dead hands. Aragorn leaned low over his horse's neck, soaked to the bone, the cold biting through cloth and skin alike, but he pressed on. He had not died in the fall, though he had come close. It was not fate or strength that saved him, only sheer will. He had faced death many times, but something deeper stirred within him now. He had to return. The war had come, and his place was at the heart of it. When he arrived at Helm's Deep, the gatekeepers shouted in disbelief. Wet and shivering, he strode into the keep like a ghost risen from the grave. The men cheered, some wept. Éowyn rushed to him, her relief written in every breath, but Aragorn looked first for the king. Theoden embraced him, clasping his arm in silent brotherhood. Then came Gimli, laughing even through the fear, and Legolas, his sharp eyes filled with unspoken relief. They had little time. The Hornburg was ancient and strong, its walls thick and high, but it had never faced the kind of assault now marching toward it. Saruman's army was near. From the tower, they could see the glow of torches spreading across the valley like a firestorm. 10,000 Uruk-hai, black-armoured, disciplined, fearless. Aragorn moved among the defenders. He spoke to the boys carrying arrows, to the old men sharpening blades, dulled by time. He offered not just strategy, but hope. He placed a hand on a shoulder, offered a quiet word, stood as tall and unshaken as the walls themselves. Many there did not know his name, but they felt something in him, a calm in the coming storm. Night fell. The sky turned a deep, bruised blue, and rain continued to fall, whispering down the stone like tears. The enemy began to march. The sound of their drums was distant at first, then louder, steady, relentless. Boom, boom, boom. The deeping wall loomed before them, torches casting long shadows across its wet surface. Aragorn stood with Legolas and Gimli on the parapet, scanning the black sea of movement below. Gimli muttered, "They'll be upon us soon enough." Legolas replied, "So it begins." Aragorn said nothing. He drew his sword and breathed in deeply. Then came the war cries, and the assault began. Arrows flew first, dark against the rain. The defenders responded, loosing shafts into the mass of Uruks. The clang of impact echoed through the gorge. Ladders were raised, siege weapons pushed forward. Saruman's army moved like a machine, its parts oiled with hatred and fire. Aragorn fought without pause. He moved along the wall like a force of nature, cutting down foes, pulling men back from the edge, rallying the defence wherever it faltered. His voice rang through the storm, not loud but steady, guiding. He was not a king commanding from a throne, but a warrior in the thick of battle, shoulder to shoulder with those he sought to protect. Gimli fought beside him, grumbling with joy and counting his kills. Legolas's arrows never missed, swift as lightning and just as deadly. But the enemy was unyielding. Explosives, strange and foul, were placed at the base of the wall. With a deafening roar, a section of stone shattered, and the Uruks poured through. The fighting turned desperate. In the chaos, Aragorn was everywhere, pulling the wounded to safety, holding breaches with bloodied hands, face streaked with sweat and rain and battle. And still they came. Hour after hour, the defence dwindled. Helm's Deep was no longer a fortress. It was a last breath. Hope began to fade. Men looked to the gates, to the sky, and found no rescue. But Aragorn stood. He stood even as the horn of Helm's Deep cracked from overuse. He stood when the walls shook beneath him. He stood when even Theoden began to despair. Then at dawn, when the first light of morning touched the clouds, Aragorn turned to the king. "There is still one chance," he said. "Let us ride out, one last charge." Theoden met his eyes and saw no fear, and so they mounted. The gates opened. The riders of Rohan, led by Aragorn and Theoden, thundered into the ranks of the Uruk-hai. They rode with death behind them and glory before them, cutting through the black tide with sword and spear. And then, from the ridge to the east, came another sound, the horns of the Rohirrim. Gandalf appeared atop a white horse, gleaming in the morning light, with Éomer and 1,000 riders behind him. They charged down the slope into the valley, sunlight blazing from their blades, scattering the darkness like shattered glass. The Uruk-hai broke. They fled into the forest that had not been there before. Trees that had crept up in the night, ancient and vengeful. The forest closed behind them. None returned. Helm's Deep was saved. The battle was won. And Aragorn stood once more on the parapet, drenched in blood and rain, watching the sun rise over the broken fields. His sword was heavy in his hand, but his eyes were clear. It was not the end, but it was a beginning. The morning after, Helm's Deep dawned in gold, casting long shadows across the field of broken stone and shattered armour. Smoke lingered where torches had burned, and the air was thick with the scent of blood, rain and ash. The valley that had echoed with the cries of war now held only silence, solemn, stunned silence. Aragorn walked among the wounded and the dead, his sword sheathed, his eyes heavy. He paused to help those who still breathed, knelt beside men whose names he would never know. There were no songs for this kind of victory. The cost was too high. The young had fallen, the old had bled, and yet, through it all, Rohan still stood. He found Theoden standing on the battlements, his cloak catching the wind, gaze fixed on the horizon. "We have survived," the king said, his voice like gravel smoothed by sorrow. "But for how long?" Aragorn looked east. The mountains loomed as ever, and beyond them, the darkness of Mordor brewed behind its veil. "Long enough to make a stand," he said softly. "Long enough to choose our end." Beside them, Legolas and Gimli joined silently. The elf was serene, though his eyes glistened with the memory of battle. Gimli's beard was matted with grime, but his spirit still burned. "We did well," the dwarf grunted, "and I still beat your count." "By one," Legolas answered. "I will allow it this once." A moment of quiet laughter passed among them, brief and bittersweet. But the war was far from over. Word came from Gandalf that Saruman still held Isengard. Though the army he had sent was destroyed, his tower remained. Orthanc, black and indestructible, set in the middle of a great ringed fortress. The wizard had not surrendered, his treachery had not ended. And so the company rode. With the king and his men, with Gandalf leading them once more, they turned toward Isengard. Aragorn rode at the front, eyes scanning the road ahead. He carried no banner, but every man who followed saw him as something more than a ranger. They saw in him the makings of a king. The road led through the green hills of Rohan, past small villages where people emerged from their homes wide-eyed to see the heroes of Helm's Deep ride by. Aragorn said little, but he met their eyes with quiet strength, offering no promises, only presence. That, they knew, was enough. When they came to Isengard, they found the unexpected. The fortress was flooded. The great gates lay broken, the courtyard submerged in water, and the stone walls blackened by fire and time. Trees had risen where none should be, and amidst the ruins walked figures as old as the hills, Ents, shepherds of the forest. Treebeard met them at the gates. He was ancient and slow-moving, yet unyielding. A creature of bark and bough, wise beyond reckoning, he had led the march of Fangorn against Saruman and torn down the walls of industry with root and flood. Aragorn watched in awe. Nature itself had risen against the destruction wrought by the White Wizard. No sword could have done what the Ents had done. Not fire, not war machines, only the patient fury of the forest. Saruman, however, still lived. He was trapped within his tower, Orthanc, high above, unreachable. Gandalf approached with authority, his white robes billowing in the wind, and called the traitor forth. From a high window, Saruman appeared, his voice still honeyed with arrogance. He tried to sway them with words, to cast doubt, to divide. His gaze fell on Theoden, then Aragorn. "You wear no crown, son of Arathorn," he sneered. "You are no king." Aragorn met his gaze without flinching. "I do not need a crown to know who I am," he replied. Gandalf raised his hand, and with a word of command he broke Saruman's staff. The tower trembled. The power that had cloaked the wizard was torn away like smoke on the wind. Saruman stumbled back from the window, diminished, a prisoner in his own fortress. Then a strange thing happened. From the tower, cast by a sudden hand, a small object fell, glinting as it tumbled through the air. It struck the stairs near Gandalf and rolled to a stop at Aragorn's feet. A palantir. One of the seeing stones of old, relics from Númenor, rare and perilous. Gandalf scooped it up quickly, wrapping it in cloth. "Too dangerous for idle hands," he said. But Aragorn had seen it, felt something stir as it passed through his hands. It was no ordinary relic. It was a window into Sauron's mind and into the heart of darkness. That night they made camp outside the walls of Isengard. Aragorn sat apart, near the embers of a dying fire. His thoughts wandered far, across the plains of Gondor, across the peaks of the Ephel Duath, and into the ash-choked lands of Mordor. The ring was still out there. Frodo and Sam were alone, and he could no longer guide them. Gandalf joined him, lowering himself with a sigh. "You feel the weight of it all," the wizard said. "I feel powerless," Aragorn replied. "Every choice leads to another darkness." "You are not powerless. You are chosen." Aragorn turned his gaze toward the palantir, wrapped in cloth near Gandalf's side. "He sees. Through that, through other eyes, he will learn of us." Gandalf nodded. "He may, but he will not know everything." And then he looked at Aragorn, long and deep. "There will come a time," he said, "when you must show yourself, when the shadow must see that the line of kings has not ended." Aragorn did not speak, but the words settled into him, like seeds in stone. The next morning they turned back toward Edoras. Theoden would return to his people, and Gandalf would ride elsewhere, swift as light, for the world was moving fast now, and the eye of Sauron was waking. As they rode, Aragorn carried more than his sword. He carried the memory of what had been lost, and the promise of what still might be won. The ride back to Edoras was gentler than the road to war, but the silence among the riders was heavier. The land had been scarred by shadow, and though the skies were blue above the plains, they carried with them the lingering weight of what had passed, and the tension of what lay ahead. Aragorn rode near Theoden, the wind tugging at his dark hair, his eyes ever watchful. He spoke little, but his mind was restless. Each turn of the world brought them closer to a war they were not prepared to fight. Gondor stood alone, isolated, while Rohan licked its wounds. Frodo and Sam were far beyond his reach, carrying the ring into the heart of darkness. All he could do now was lead where he could, and wait for the moment his path would rejoin theirs. At Edoras, the city opened its gates to welcome home its king. People lined the streets to see the return of their warriors, some wounded, some gone, some changed. Children stood with flowers, women wept silently for sons who would not return. The survivors of Helm's Deep were heroes, but heroes born of desperation and blood. Theoden dismounted first, stepping onto the stone paths of his city, not as a broken ruler, but as a king reborn. He walked upright, armor still on his shoulders, and his people saw strength in him again. Hope, kindled faintly, flickered in their eyes. Aragorn followed behind him, his own presence drawing quiet glances. Whispers passed through the crowd. Some had heard his name now, not just Strider, not just a ranger. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur. There was no proclamation, no fanfare, but it was as though the people felt it rising within him. That night, the halls of Meduseld were lit with golden fire. A feast was held, not of celebration, but of gratitude. Meat roasted on spits, mead passed in wooden cups, and songs, old and mournful, were sung for the fallen. The men of Rohan sang of Helm the Hammerhand, of Eorl the Young, and of the long ride through shadow. Their voices filled the hall like a chorus of thunder softened by memory. Aragorn sat beside Gimli and Legolas near the edge of the gathering, accepting the cup passed to him with quiet nods. He drank little. His thoughts wandered. Éowyn approached, wrapped in white, her face calm but eyes searching. She knelt beside him, not as one seeking attention, but as one seeking understanding. "You do not smile," she said softly. Aragorn glanced at her. "The night is for the dead." "But they would not want silence," she said. "They would want songs, fire, life." He looked down into the golden drink. "I have sung enough for the dead." Éowyn studied him. "You are a man of sorrows." "I am a man of duty," he replied. "The sorrow comes with it." She reached for his hand then, tentative. He allowed it for a moment, her fingers warm, fragile, but gently pulled away. Not harshly, but with finality. Her gaze lowered, but her voice remained steady. "You love her, the elf maiden?" "Yes," he said, "with all that I am." Éowyn stood, the firelight catching in her hair. "Then I pity her," she whispered, "for your love is heavy." And she walked away. Aragorn remained in silence. The next day, Gandalf called him aside. The wizard had returned only hours before, swift as the wind, bearing grim tidings. The beacons of Gondor were not lit. No call for aid had come. Denethor, steward of Gondor and father of Boromir, had shut his city against the world. He would not ask for help. He would not send for kings he did not acknowledge. Minas Tirith stood proud but alone, and Mordor had begun to stir. Gandalf turned his gaze to Aragorn. "You must take the paths of the dead." Aragorn felt the words like a cold wind down his spine. "You know what lies there." "Yes," Gandalf said, "and so do you." It was a path none dared tread, an ancient road beneath the mountains, haunted by the Oathbreakers, men who, in the elder days, had sworn allegiance to Isildur but broke their vow. Cursed, bound in death, they haunted the dark halls beyond mortal sight. "But they will follow you," Gandalf said, "because you are Isildur's heir, because the time has come to claim what is yours." Aragorn said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded. He left Meduseld before dawn with only a handful of companions, Legolas and Gimli, faithful beyond all reason. He carried Andúril, the sword reforged from the shards of Narsil, flame of the west, now whole again in his hands. Its edge gleamed in the half-light like starlight on water. In his heart, the call of kingship had grown louder, not as a crown to be worn, but as a burden to be accepted. They rode south, through the lands of Rohan, past rivers swollen with spring thaw, through valleys where no birds sang. The sky darkened with each passing day, and behind them the weight of the world seemed to lean forward, urging them onward. At last, they reached the haunted mountain. The entrance to the paths of the dead yawned before them, a black arch in the side of the stone, where wind moaned like voices long buried. Horses shied and would not enter. The mountain itself seemed to breathe. Gimli hesitated. "No dwarf has ever entered there," he muttered. Legolas said nothing, but his hand gripped his bow more tightly. Aragorn turned to them. "I do not ask you to follow." Gimli squared his shoulders. "I do not follow orders," he said. "I follow friends." Legolas only nodded, and so Aragorn lit the torch and stepped into the darkness. Stone swallowed them. The walls closed tight. The air was still and dry as a tomb. The light of the torch flickered against walls carved with forgotten runes. No sound came but the whisper of their breath and the faint echo of their boots upon the stone. But Aragorn felt them. Eyes watching, shapes in the dark, cold presences that lingered just beyond the torchlight. The dead. They moved through chambers where time itself had turned to dust. Skeletal banners hung from forgotten thrones. Armor rusted in heaps. The weight of broken oaths clung to every inch of stone. And still they pressed on, deeper into the mountain's heart. At last, in the great hollow beneath the mountain, Aragorn raised his voice. He spoke with command, with lineage, with power. "You will suffer me." The shadows shifted, and the dead came forth, silent, pale, dozens, hundreds. They surrounded him, faces void of light, eyes hollow. Aragorn did not step back. "I am Isildur's heir," he said. "You swore an oath to him. You failed. But now you have a chance to fulfill it. Fight for me, and be free." The silence held. Then one stepped forward, a king, or what had once been a king. He bowed his head, and the dead agreed. The dead followed. They did not speak, nor breathe, nor make any sound but the cold whisper of wind that swirled through the corridors of the mountain. Aragorn walked at their head, torch held high, Andúril sheathed but heavy at his side. Legolas walked beside him, his elven eyes calm but alert, and Gimli close behind, grumbling softly under his breath but unwavering in his stride. They emerged from the darkness at the southern mouth of the mountain, where the light of day was pale and thin as fog. The sky above had turned sickly grey, smeared with the breath of Mordor's fires. A shadow was spreading across the land, not yet darkness, but the anticipation of it. A gathering pressure that seemed to pull at the soul. Below them lay the plain of the Morthond Vale, where villages stood silent and fields lay untended. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper of dread, and people looked to the hills with fear in their eyes. The three hunters had passed beyond legend now. Everywhere Aragorn went, the dead followed. They passed through the lands of southern Gondor swiftly, covering miles in the span of hours, for no living creature dared bar their path. The Oathbreakers moved as a tide of mist, their translucent forms seen only in glimpses, in the corner of the eye or the hush of twilight. Some villagers fled before them. Others knelt, not knowing who the stranger was, but sensing the weight of destiny in his step. Andúril shone brighter with each passing hour. The blade that had once broken beneath Elendil now sang with the return of the line it had waited for. Aragorn bore it not with pride, but with purpose. It was not a symbol of conquest. It was a beacon. Their destination, Pelargir, the great port city upon the Anduin, where corsair ships had gathered under Sauron's command. Black sails filled the river, ready to deliver ruin to Gondor's southern coasts, to cut off Minas Tirith from aid, to burn what little remained undefended. But Aragorn had not come to plead. He came to take command. The ride was long and the night deepened. The dead remained behind him, silent and watchful. He did not look back. He did not need to. He felt them with every breath. They waited for a moment, a signal, a war. At last, from a high ridge, they saw Pelargir. The river shimmered with torchlight and flame. Hundreds of ships filled the bay, sails furled, crews readying weapons and loading siege engines. Corsairs shouted across decks in cruel tongues, laughing, unbothered, unaware. Aragorn stepped forward. Behind him, the dead rose like a tide. With no warning, the assault began, not from Aragorn's sword, not from a horn, but from fear. A sudden silence fell across the ships. Men froze at their oars, eyes turned to the hills, and there they saw him, one man and a host of phantoms. The corsairs panicked. Some tried to flee. Others drew swords in trembling hands. Arrows were loosed, but passed through the dead like wind through smoke. The Oathbreakers descended in eerie silence, moving through ship and man alike. No blade could stop them. No fire could drive them back. They were not of the living. They were dread incarnate. Aragorn boarded the flagship himself, striding through the chaos, Andúril gleaming in the storm-lit air. The captain of the corsairs met him on the deck, sword drawn, defiant. "You are no king," he spat. But Aragorn said nothing. He raised Andúril, and the man fell to his knees. The ships were seized, the river taken, the enemy routed. The men of Gondor who remained at Pelargir, scattered and leaderless, now rallied around him. They had heard of the ranger. Now they saw him as something more. They knelt before him, asking for orders, calling him my lord, even if they did not yet say my king. But Aragorn did not linger. He turned to the dead. Their pale faces watched him with hollow eyes, waiting. Their oaths had been broken long ago in another age, on another battlefield. But now, at last, the heir of Isildur had summoned them, and they had answered. "You have fulfilled your oath," Aragorn said, voice clear above the wind. "The curse is broken. Be at peace." And with those words, they faded. Not all at once, but like breath into the evening. One by one, the shadows drifted upward, dissolving into the sky, into the air, into silence. The field where they had stood was empty, save for the echo of something ancient and the soft sigh of the wind. Aragorn remained still. He had done what none before him had dared. He had passed the paths of the dead and returned, not as a man bound by fear or fate, but as one who had claimed both. Not with force, but with promise. The ships of the corsairs now belonged to Gondor. He turned to his companions, Gimli leaning on his axe, Legolas already climbing the nearest mast to scout the sky. Around them, the men of Gondor prepared the sails, raised the anchors, and looked to the north, where smoke from Minas Tirith already marked the sky like a bruise. The city was under siege, and they would not let it fall. Aragorn stepped onto the deck of the lead ship. He looked once more to the stars above, dim behind clouds but still burning. Then he took the wheel and the fleet turned upriver, black sails now bearing a different fate. Hope sailed with them, and in the heart of the storm, a king drew near. The ships cut through the Anduin like blades through silk, their black sails billowing in the wind, grim against the pale sky. But these were not vessels of shadow anymore. Beneath their decks marched not the corsairs of Umbar, but Gondorian soldiers, hardened, ready, bearing white tree emblems on their shields. The men had been rallied by Aragorn's call, and they followed him now with eyes sharpened by belief. The river shimmered with ash and mist. Smoke curled in the east like claws stretching toward the sky. In the distance, the peaks of the Ephel-Duath loomed, Mordor's mountains swallowing the horizon in shadow. But beyond the darkness, one city stood, white, proud and besieged, Minas Tirith. Its tiered walls, like circles of pearl, rose from the mountainside, battered by the storm of war. Siege towers loomed against its flanks. Great engines hurled fire and stone. The enemy was already at the gates. Aragorn stood on the prow of the lead ship, Andúril sheathed at his side, cloak flaring behind him in the wind. He watched the distant battle unfold, saw the black banners of Mordor flapping along the Pelennor fields, saw the flashes of steel, the burning of siege fire, and the distant forms of men falling like grains of wheat. The fleet moved fast. The wind favoured them, swift and fierce from the south. Some among the men whispered that the Valar themselves had bent the weather. Others said it was the will of Elendil's line returned. Whatever the truth, none questioned the man who stood at the ship's helm. He no longer looked like a ranger. He no longer moved as one who wandered. He had become something else entirely, something the world had not seen for an age. A king. The Pelennor fields were chaos. Outside the walls of Minas Tirith, war had erupted in full fury. Orcs by the tens of thousands poured from the east, their war cries rising like smoke into the sky. Oliphants, massive beasts with armour and towers, thundered across the plain, scattering cavalry and smashing through defences. Men of Gondor fought valiantly, their white standards defiant amid the dark sea. But they were failing. Inside the city, Denethor, the steward of Gondor, had fallen to despair. Madness claimed him. Gandalf had taken command in the chaos, rallying the defenders, bearing light where only ruin had stood. And from the north, the riders of Rohan had come. Theoden, crowned and bright with battle fever, led his horsemen into the fray with the might of old songs. Horns rang across the plains as the Rohirrim clashed with the armies of Mordor, scattering orcs beneath their hooves. It was a moment of beauty amid terror, a glimpse of valor unyielding. But it was not enough. The tide had not yet turned. Then, from the river, came the black sails. Gondor's defenders saw them with dread, enemy reinforcements, doom approaching on the wind. But the enemy saw them too, and paused. For the sails bore no cries of conquest, no shouts of cruelty, only silence, until the first ship struck the shore, and from it stepped Aragorn. He leapt to the earth, sword unsheathed, Anduril flashing like fire in the gloom. Behind him poured soldiers, not corsairs but free men, fresh and burning with purpose. And behind them still came those who had ridden with him from Pelagia, men of the southern fiefs, bearing their own standards, their own griefs, their own oaths newly given. Aragorn did not wait. He charged into the chaos. Gimli and Legolas were at his sides, as always. The elf loosed arrows with otherworldly precision, while the dwarf laughed grimly, his axe a blur. The banner of the White Tree unfurled behind Aragorn, and the tide of battle shifted. The armies of Mordor faltered. They had expected terror. They had expected darkness. But they had not expected hope. And hope, when it strikes in the heart of despair, is like a blade sharper than any iron. The field became a maelstrom. Aragorn fought through ranks of orcs, his sword singing through the foul air. He faced a troll guard and brought it down with a single stroke. He shielded the fallen, lifted the wounded, and stood like a storm in the heart of battle. His voice rang out, rallying men who had once given up, calling them back to their feet, back to their duty. Within the city, the defenders cried out, "It is the king!" The cry spread, from gate to wall, from street to tower. "The king has come!" And though he wore no crown, though no trumpet had announced him, all knew it was true. Aragorn had returned. By the day's end, the field was theirs. The enemy broke and fled, some retreating toward the river, others falling before the blades of Gondor and Rohan. The great beasts fell, the siege towers burned. And in the stillness that followed, smoke rising into the blood-red sky, the free peoples of Middle-earth drew breath. Minas Tirith had not fallen, but the price had been grave. Theoden lay dying, his body broken beneath his fallen steed. Éowyn had faced the Witch King of Angmar, and with Merry's help slain the unkillable. But she, too, was broken and near death, lying pale beneath the city's walls, and Faramir, son of Denethor, burned with fever from a wound suffered in courage. The city mourned and rejoiced in the same breath. Aragorn did not enter the city by the gates. He waited. He made camp outside the walls, tending the wounded, speaking to the captains, gathering the scattered strength of Gondor's armies. He did not sit upon a throne, nor speak of crowns. Instead, he asked for healing herbs, for water, for news of Frodo and Sam, still silent, still lost beyond the mountains. Then came the moment that changed the breath of the city. Aragorn walked the streets of Minas Tirith, not as a king, but as a healer. He entered the houses of healing, where Éowyn and Faramir lay, and he called for Athelas, the king's foil, known to few and forgotten by most. With gentle hands and words of Elvish, he washed their wounds, laid his palm on their brows, and whispered strength into their bones. When Faramir stirred from his fever and called him "my lord," those who stood by fell to silence. For the old saying had returned to their minds, "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known." But Aragorn asked for no recognition, only time, only unity, only that those who had bled on the Pelennor stand together once more, for the greatest war still waited. For beyond the mountains, beyond the plain, the Eye was watching, and the ring was nearing the fire. The city of Minas Tirith had survived, but it did not sleep. In its white streets, firelight still flickered, and smoke clung like a veil over rooftops. The wounded moaned in the houses of healing. The dead were laid in rows beneath shrouds, and the living moved slowly, like those who had seen death pass close by, and were still unsure whether it had left them untouched. and in the courtyard beneath the tower of Ecthelion, Aragorn stood beneath the blossoming branches of the white tree. The tree was still bare, its limbs stark and silver in the moonlight, the petals long withered, its roots deep but dormant. Yet he stood before it not with sorrow but reverence. He did not reach to touch it. He merely watched. For it, like the land, was waiting. Behind him, the sounds of the city faded, and the wind carried the faint cries of gulls from the distant river. The stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere beyond the Ethel Duath, two small figures walked ever closer to the heart of the storm, unseen, unspoken. Aragorn felt them, though he could not name it. A tightness in the air, a presence missing but not gone. A thread stretched across the world. He turned away from the tree as Gandalf approached, cloak trailing, staff tapping lightly against the stones. "They will not last much longer," the wizard said. "Not alone." Aragorn nodded. "They've come farther than we ever thought possible," he said, "but the last leg will be the heaviest." Gandalf gazed toward the east, "And we cannot guide them." "No," Aragorn replied, "but we can give them a chance." They walked together in silence, through the sleeping city, down marble steps and past quiet courtyards, until they came to the council chamber, where the captains of the West were gathered. Imrahil of Dol Amroth, tall and noble. Éomer, newly crowned King of Rohan, his grief still fresh upon his brow. Legolas, quiet as moonlight. Gimli, grim and ever loyal. They rose as Aragorn entered. No throne sat at the head of the chamber, but all eyes turned to him. He did not sit. He stood before them, not as a sovereign, but as one who had walked through fire and returned with purpose. "The enemy believes he has won the field," Aragorn began, "that the ring is beyond our grasp and that all that remains is conquest." None interrupted. He looked to each of them, then continued, voice calm, resolute. "We must prove him wrong." Gandalf stepped forward. "We will march on the Black Gate." Murmurs rippled through the room. Shock, disbelief, fear. "March to Mordor?" Imrahil asked. "With what force?" Aragorn answered. "Not to win, not to conquer, but to distract, to draw the eye away from what he most fears." "And risk everything?" Éomer said, his hand tightening into a fist. "Everything is already at risk," Gandalf replied. The room fell quiet. Aragorn stepped to the centre. "If Frodo yet lives, and I believe he does, then this is our only hope. We are the sword that must strike the gate while the dagger slips beneath the shadow. If we fail, we fall. But if we succeed..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. One by one, the captains of the West nodded, and so the final march began. They gathered what men they could, less than 7,000, veterans from the Pelennor, fresh-faced youths from the hills of Gondor, Rohirrim who had lost fathers and sons at Helm's Deep. No banners of conquest were raised, only the emblems of resistance, the white tree of Gondor, the sun of Rohan, the silver swan of Dol Amroth. At dawn, Aragorn led them from the city. He rode not in royal regalia, but in dark armour, Andúril gleaming at his side, his cloak torn by wind and time. The people lined the walls and watched in silence. Some wept, others saluted. Many simply stood still, their hands pressed to their hearts. They marched eastward, through the ruin of the Pelennor, over the fields where so many had fallen. Past Osgiliath, broken and reclaimed, where orcs had fled before the fury of the river. Into Ithilien, where trees still grew green, though touched now with the breath of Mordor. At night, the sky glowed red in the distance. Mount Doom churned on the horizon, and as they came closer, Aragorn felt the weight of each step. The land itself resisted them. The air thickened, the ground grew hard and bitter. But still they marched. No man turned back. On the 7th day they reached the Black Gate. Morannon, it loomed like the mouth of death, vast, black, jagged with iron teeth. 2 towering bastions flanked it, and beyond, the shadows of Mordor waited like coiled serpents. Aragorn ordered the army to halt. He stood before the gate, Gandalf at his side. Legolas and Gimli flanked him, Éomer, Imrahil, and the banners of Gondor and Rohan waited behind. A silence fell over the field, a silence deeper than any the men had ever known. Then a trumpet sounded, and the mouth of Sauron emerged. He rode a black horse, eyes hidden beneath a dark helm, mouth twisted with mockery. In his hand he bore a token, a grey cloak, a small mithril coat, and a dagger. Frodo's. The hope of many broke in that moment. Cries rose behind Aragorn, anguish, despair, but he did not yield. He looked into the face of the lieutenant of the Dark Lord and said nothing. His eyes, hard and clear, held no fear, no doubt, "You lie," he said. The mouth of Sauron laughed, but Aragorn stepped forward. Anduril flashed in his hand. He did not speak a word, but the sword answered for him, cleaving through arrogance and shadow. The rider fled. The gate groaned, and then it opened. The armies of Mordor poured forth, an endless tide of orcs, trolls, fell beasts, and fire. They came with shrieks and drums, with banners of the Red Eye and the stench of ruin. The captains of the West looked to Aragorn. He raised his sword and spoke one word. Hold. The world narrowed. Time slowed. They stood at the edge of doom, not for victory, but to give hope a chance. To give a hobbit, somewhere in the dark, one more breath, one more step. And in that moment, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, held the line. Not as a ranger, not as a soldier, but as a king. The black gate yawned open like the maw of some ancient beast, and through it surged the fury of Mordor. The earth trembled beneath the weight of armoured trolls and siege beasts, of 100,000 orcs driven by hunger and hate. The sky itself dimmed, though the sun still climbed behind the haze, veiled by the smoke that poured endlessly from Mount Doom. But before that sea of shadow stood a line of light. The army of the West, vastly outnumbered, formed their ranks atop the scorched earth outside the Morannon. There were no reinforcements, no hidden cavalry, no hope of retreat. Their line was thin, their banners few, their blades worn from long battle. Yet in that moment there was no fear in their eyes, only resolve. At the centre stood Aragorn. His dark hair was windswept, his armour dulled by days of travel, but Anduril shone with the fire of the sun itself. He had no crown on his brow, but none who saw him doubted his claim. He stood like Elendil reborn, tall and grave, bearing the weight of a world on his shoulders. To his left stood Gandalf, staff in hand, cloak fluttering behind him like smoke on stone. To his right, Éomer, fierce and silent, his sword already drawn. Behind them, Imrahil of Dol Amroth held his white swan banner high, and the men of Rohan, Gondor, and the southern fiefs formed into shields and spears, ready for their final hour. Aragorn looked over the field. He saw boys among his ranks who had never tasted war, old men who had come because there was no one left, knights who had fought in 10 battles already and still rode forward. And he saw his friends, Gimli adjusting his grip on his axe, Legolas with his bow already knocked, eyes narrowed on the advancing horde. He took a breath. No words, no grand speech, only action. He raised Anduril and charged. The line followed him with a thunderous cry, not of despair, but of defiance. Swords clashed, shields locked, and the army of the West met the flood of Mordor like a rock meets the sea. The battlefield became chaos. Screams, steel, flame, blood. The clang of blade upon blade echoed like a drumbeat of fate. Aragorn fought at the front. His blade flashed like starlight, cleaving through orc armour as if it were cloth. He felled a massive troll with 3 strikes, the last one straight to the beast's eye. He fought with the fury of a man who knew the world's last hope rested on a blade's edge. And yet he did not look for glory. He looked only to hold the line, to delay, to distract. Because somewhere, far behind enemy lines, 2 hobbits still climbed a mountain. On the slopes of Orodruin, Frodo and Sam neared the end. Aragorn did not know what torments they faced, what darkness whispered to them, or how close Sauron was to discovering them. But he knew one thing, that every second bought with blood on this field was a second that might save them. The enemy pressed harder. The Nazgûl circled above, screeching like knives in the wind. One swooped low, nearly brushing the banners of Gondor, but Legolas loosed a silver arrow into its neck and it veered into the mountain with a scream. Trolls broke through the left flank. Aragorn rushed to meet them. Éomer fell beside him and rose again, his helm split. They fought back to back, the Prince of Rohan and the heir of Gondor, blades red with the black blood of the enemy. Everywhere he moved, Aragorn became a symbol. He lifted fallen men back to their feet, shouted commands to fill the gaps, led counter-charges into the heart of the enemy. Hope burned in him, not from certainty but from choice. He had chosen to believe. Then came the moment the world shuddered. A tremor shook the battlefield. Mount Doom roared. The eye turned. Not metaphorically, but truly. High above Barad-dûr, the eye of Sauron, vast and lidless, suddenly shifted, its attention torn away from the battlefield, drawn toward the Fire Mountain, toward something he had not expected. Frodo, Aragorn felt it. not with his body but with something deeper, a sensation like ice crawling across his skin, a momentary slackening in the fury of the enemy ranks, as though the will that drove them had faltered. He turned toward the dark lands and smiled. Gandalf's voice rang out over the din. He sees it. He sees it now. The Nazgul wheeled sharply, abandoning the battle, screeching westward toward Mount Doom. The ground trembled again. A shadow swept over the field, not from an army, but from the shifting of the earth itself. Smoke billowed higher from the mountain, and then light. Bright, searing light erupted from the heart of Mordor. A shockwave followed. The sky split with a rumble like thunder and the cry of something ancient breaking. Then Barad-dûr began to crumble. Piece by piece, stone by black stone, the tower of the Dark Lord collapsed into itself. Its foundation cracked. Its spires fell like spears into the plain. The eye flickered, once, twice, then flared wide with a scream that pierced the souls of all who saw it, and vanished. The ring was gone. Sauron was broken. For a moment, all was still. Then, the army of Mordor broke. The orcs fled, howling, throwing down their weapons. Trolls bellowed in confusion. Some ran, others collapsed in place, their will evaporated. The Black Gate shuddered as if in pain, then creaked inward. Victory. Aragorn fell to his knees, sword point buried in the earth, gasping. Around him, the men of Gondor and Rohan stood blinking, bloodied and stunned. The impossible had happened. It was over. Gandalf stepped to his side, his face bathed in the red glow of the mountain's dying fire. "It is finished," he whispered. "The ring is destroyed." Aragorn looked to the east once more, but not with fear, with hope. "Then let us find them," he said softly. "Let us bring them home." The ashes of Mordor fell like snow. Grey and fine, they drifted across the battlefield, softening the broken earth and covering the fallen in a silent shroud. The sky above had begun to change. No longer suffocated by smoke, but tinged with gold at the horizon, as if the sun itself had dared to breathe again. The armies of the west stood in stunned stillness. Swords dropped from weary hands. Helmets were removed. Men stared not at the ruin of their enemies, but at the impossible fact that they still lived. The fields outside the Black Gate, once a place of certain death, had become the soil of deliverance. Aragorn rose from his knees, Andúril still clutched in his hand, its blade smeared with ash and blood. His breath came slow, heavy with fatigue. His hair hung damp against his face, and every joint in his body ached with the weight of battle and waiting. But his eyes searched the east. "Frodo," he whispered. Gandalf stood beside him, unmoving, his staff planted in the earth. "They have done it," he said, "by their courage and suffering." The wizard's face bore a deep solemnity and a kind of wonder, as if even he, with all his foresight and wisdom, had not fully believed this day would come. He looked to the horizon where Mount Doom still fumed, its peak broken, molten light spilling like blood from a wound in the world. "There is no victory without cost," he added. A hush settled over the host. Then slowly it began. Men falling to their knees, some with tears on their faces, some in prayer, some simply from the weight of exhaustion and relief. Horns were not blown. No songs were sung. There was only breath and silence and the soft crumbling of stone in the east. Aragorn turned toward the captains. Éomer, pale and stained with the mud of battle, his sword red and his eyes hollow. Imrahil, proud and blooded, holding the white banner of Dol Amroth in one trembling hand. "They are gone," Aragorn said quietly. "Frodo and Sam." Gandalf's face was unreadable. "They have passed beyond the veil of fire, but they are not lost." The wizard lifted his staff, and with a signal, a handful of men began to prepare camp. Wounded were gathered. Water was passed between trembling hands. No one spoke loudly. The ruin of Sauron still hung heavy in the air, and though the Dark Lord's presence had vanished, his shadow had not yet lifted entirely. That night, Aragorn did not sleep. He sat by a small fire at the edge of the camp, alone, staring into the embers. Andúril lay across his knees, unsheathed, its edge darkened by soot. He said nothing. He barely moved. In his mind, he saw Frodo, fragile and resolute, burdened beyond reason, walking into the heart of darkness with nothing but hope. He saw Sam beside him, loyal and stubborn, carrying him when the strength of the world failed. Aragorn had led armies, but they had saved it. At dawn the sky cleared, and with it came the eagles. They rose from the east like living stars, vast, golden-winged, silent in their flight. Aragorn stood as one passed over him, casting a shadow that brushed the ruined stone of Mordor's gate. Then came Gandalf, mounted now on Shadowfax. His cloak billowed behind him like the tail of a comet, and his face shone with urgency and clarity. "They are alive," he said, "but they lie in ruin atop the mountain. I go to them." Aragorn met his gaze. No words passed. None were needed. Shadowfax reared and charged eastward, faster than sight, the white horse vanishing into the rising light as the wings of the eagles followed in his wake. Aragorn watched them go, hand clenched around Undoril's hilt, heart torn between joy and fear. The fate of the ring had been decided. The tide had turned, but the ones who had borne the heaviest burdens still hovered between life and death. He waited. For hours he stood at the edge of the camp, eyes fixed to the east. The wind rose gently. The sun climbed higher. The fields grew still. Then a cry went up. He turned. Far above, descending slowly from the sky, came the eagles, and in their great talons they bore two small forms, wrapped in cloaks of grey and brown, faces pale, unmoving. The eagles swept down into the camp with the grace of dreams. The soldiers stepped back in reverence, creating space without command. The creatures landed upon a small rise of earth, and there laid down Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. Aragorn was the first to reach them. He knelt beside Frodo, placing a hand gently on the hobbit's brow. It was hot with fever, but not lifeless. The breath was faint, but present. Sam stirred slightly, his face etched with soot and sweat, a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "They live," Aragorn whispered. A cheer broke across the camp. Not a shout of victory, but a sound of release, of thousands of men exhaling grief, dread, and disbelief in a single note. Tears flowed freely. Even Gimli turned his face away. Legolas stood tall, hand on Aragorn's shoulder, and in that moment the war truly ended. Not with the fall of a tower, not with the shattering of a gate, but with the soft breath of a halfling, still alive, still dreaming, his burden finally lifted. Aragorn looked out once more at the wide, ruined land of Mordor, the land of the enemy, no longer the master of the world, and in its place something new stirred, not victory, but peace, earned, painful, and real. The days after the war passed like a slow exhale. Mordor lay silent, its black plains now cracked and lifeless, the fires of Mount Doom fading to ash and steam. The Eye was gone, Barad-dûr was a ruin. The darkness that had stretched across Middle-earth for so long was lifting, not all at once, but in quiet degrees. Like frost melting from a window, like dawn rising over an exhausted world. The camp of the west remained for a time upon the Pelennor, just outside the gates of Minas Tirith. There the wounded were tended, the dead honoured, and the weary found moments of sleep for the first time in weeks. No one was eager to leave. Even victory had its cost, and the living clung to each other with quiet gratitude, not yet ready to return to ordinary days. Aragorn walked among them, not as a commander now, nor as a ranger, but as something gentler, an old soul wrapped in mortal skin, with kindness in his eyes and the silence of sorrow in his step. He moved from tent to tent, speaking with men by name, listening more than he spoke. He brought water, tended wounds, and eased pain where he could. The sword at his side was no longer drawn. It had become a symbol again, not of war, but of healing. Frodo and Sam remained in the care of the healers, deep in the houses of healing. They slept for days, locked in a stillness that was neither natural nor dark. Their faces were peaceful but worn beyond what most would endure in 10 lifetimes. Aragorn visited them daily. He brought fresh air into their chambers. He sang in the old tongue, songs of Eärendil, of Lúthien, of Númenor's star-born kings, and he waited. He did not speak of crowns. He did not speak of thrones. He only sat by their sides as one who understood the weight of quiet sacrifice. And at last they awoke. Frodo first, eyes fluttering open like petals in spring, the grey light of the morning reflected in their depths. Then Sam, with a groggy blink, muttered something about bread and a kettle on the fire. When Aragorn greeted them, he smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in many days. "You are in the White City," he said softly, "and the darkness has passed." Tears came freely then. Frodo gripped his hand, and Sam, who had braved the fire and the shadow without flinching, wept like a child. They had done what none could have asked, and now at last they could rest. Word spread through the camp that the ring-bearers had awakened. Joy bloomed like flowers in the wind. The soldiers who had fought under moonless skies now sang softly as they moved about their work. The banners of Rohan and Gondor flew higher. Even the wounded smiled through their bandages. A quiet joy had taken root. But the world moved forward, and Gondor needed a king. Gandalf came to Aragorn one morning at sunrise. They stood upon the battlements, the city stretching below them, the fields of battle now dotted with tents and new life. "It is time," the wizard said. Aragorn nodded. "I know." The coronation was prepared with a reverence that went beyond celebration. It was not a matter of display or pride. It was a rite of healing, a symbol for a world reborn. The people of Gondor, clad in white and grey, lined the streets of Minas Tirith. Flowers were thrown from balconies. Bells rang, not with the sound of war's end, but of peace's beginning. From the gates of the city, Aragorn walked on foot, in a plain robe of silver grey. No crown, no sword, only Andúril at his side, and his companions beside him. Gandalf walked ahead, leading him up the mountain road that wound to the high court of the kings. Frodo and Sam walked with him, small and quiet, bearing smiles that carried all the weight of what they had endured. Legolas and Gimli followed, banners in hand. Éomer walked behind them, silent and proud, now king of a people who had stood to the very edge of the world. And behind them, the people of Gondor. They climbed to the court of the fountain, where the white tree stood, still bare but living. There, upon the steps of the citadel, Gandalf turned. "Now come the days of the king," he said, and he placed the crown in Aragorn's hands. It was a simple thing, silver, winged like the sails of Númenor, aged but gleaming. Aragorn did not lift it to his own head. He knelt instead, bowing his head before Gandalf. But Gandalf stepped back. "Receive it from whom you will," he said, and so Aragorn rose. He took the crown, turned, and beheld the crowd, men and women of Gondor, warriors of Rohan, elves, dwarves, and halflings, the free peoples of Middle-earth. All eyes were upon him, and slowly he placed the crown upon his own brow. "I am Elessar, the Elfstone," he declared. "Aragorn, son of Arathorn, of the line of Elendil. I have come to reclaim the throne of Gondor." A cheer rose like thunder, but Aragorn raised a hand, not to silence them, but to speak again. "This day does not belong to one man," he said, "but to all who stood against darkness, to the free peoples united, to those who gave everything, and to those who still live." He turned, stepping down the stairs to where Frodo and Sam stood. He knelt before them. "My friends," he said softly, "you bow to no one." And the king knelt. Then all followed, soldiers, lords, captains, even the nobles of Gondor and the proud horse lords of Rohan. One by one they dropped to their knees, heads bowed before the smallest among them. Frodo wept openly. Sam trembled. Neither spoke. The wind stirred the petals of the white tree, and high above the clouds parted fully for the first time in weeks. Light fell upon the city like grace, touching stone and blade and skin and soil. A new age had begun, not of glory, but of quiet endurance. A king had returned. But more than that, a world had awakened. The days following Aragorn's coronation were soft and golden, as though the very air around Minas Tirith had changed. The white city, once veiled in smoke and fear, breathed again. Wounds were mended not only in bodies, but in stone, in hearts, in memory. Bells rang in tones of joy now, not alarm. The markets reopened. Children returned to the streets. Flowers were planted in courtyards scorched by siege fire. Aragorn, now King Elessar, ruled not from behind doors of iron or through messengers and guards, but among his people. He walked through the lower levels of the city, speaking with stonemasons, visiting the sick, and listening to those who once thought kings belonged only in story. He was regal without distance, solemn without pride, and when people knelt before him, he would lift them gently to their feet. Yet even in peace, his heart remained divided between what had been saved and what had yet to be healed. There was still much to do. Faramir, son of Denethor, was among the first to whom Aragorn gave honour. He named him Steward of Gondor, not as a shadow of the king, but as a partner in its rebuilding. The people loved Faramir, who had led not through fear but wisdom, and who had nearly perished defending a city that had lost its will to protect itself. Aragorn saw in him not only the nobility of Númenor, but the quiet courage of one who had been tested and had not broken. Beside Faramir, in time, stood Éowyn. She had recovered from the wounds of battle and sorrow. The light had returned to her eyes, though it shone now in a different hue. Not the restless fire of one longing for battle, but the steady glow of one who had found her own peace. it was not with Aragorn. She and he spoke often in the gardens above the city, and in one such meeting, she said softly, "I do not regret loving you." Aragorn bowed his head. "Nor do I regret being loved." They parted without sadness, and days later, she walked in the woods of Ithilien with Faramir, their laughter drifting through the leaves like music rediscovered. Legolas and Gimli remained in the city for a time, though both felt the pull of their homelands. Legolas wandered the green places of Ithilien, speaking to the trees, restoring what war had darkened. And Gimli walked with stonecutters in the ruined halls of Osgiliath, already imagining the arches he might raise, the towers he might mend. They were a strange pair to the people of Gondor, an elf and a dwarf walking shoulder to shoulder through the capital of men, but none doubted their bond. The hobbits stayed longest in the houses of healing. Frodo's wounds, though invisible, were deep. He smiled, but his eyes carried a weight that no crown, no song, no celebration could lift. Sam rarely left his side, telling stories, trimming the ivy on the stone walls, humming old tunes from the Shire. Merry and Pippin were more often in the city streets, revelling in the praise of soldiers who called them the halfling heroes, but they returned each evening to the chambers where Frodo rested. And then came the day when Aragorn called them all to the king's garden. The sun was bright above, the flowers in bloom, and the white tree, though still bare, stood straighter, as if waking from its long slumber. There Aragorn knelt before the hobbits and gave to each of them titles of honour. To Frodo he gave the Star of the Dunedain, forged anew. To Sam he offered a small silver box, marked with the seal of Galadriel. "This is soil from Lothlorien," he said. "Should you ever return to your home and find it wounded, let this help it grow again." To Merry and Pippin he gave the honour of knights, of both Gondor and Rohan, twin oaths that would bind their names to the songs of two great peoples. Then he rose, and for a while they stood there together in the quiet of the garden, the king and his fellowship, not as warriors, not as lords, but as friends, as those who had walked through fire and come through it, not untouched, but unbroken. Later that week, messengers from Arnor arrived from the north. They brought tidings from the Dunedain, news of settlements stirring again, of old roads being cleared, of people no longer afraid to speak the names of old kings. Aragorn received their reports with quiet pride, but he did not forget his promise. He journeyed alone, one morning before dawn, to a high place in the mountains behind the city. There he knelt and removed his crown. He held it in his lap as the wind whispered around him and the sun slowly rose beyond the Ethel Duath. "Elendil," he said softly, "your line endures," and then Arwen. He spoke her name not with longing, but with faith. He had not seen her since the war began. She had remained in Lothlorien with her kin, watching from afar, but he felt her now, like a breath through the leaves, like a star glimpsed in twilight. He did not know when she would come, but he knew she would, and he would wait. For now he would rebuild what had been lost, not only stone and gate, but trust. He would rule with mercy, not wrath. He would heal not just with herbs, but with words. And though he bore the title of King Elessar, he was still Aragorn, Estel, Hope. And that was what he gave, day by day, to a world learning how to live again. The summer that followed the War of the Ring was unlike any Gondor had seen in a century. The land bloomed. The river Anduin shimmered like glass beneath the sun. Birds returned to the ruined woodlands, and gardens sprouted from soil once blackened by ash. Hope did not arrive all at once. It grew slowly, like green shoots through broken stone, but it grew, and under Aragorn's gentle stewardship it took root. He walked among his people often, not as a distant ruler perched in high halls, but as one of them. He knew their names. He listened to their griefs. He helped lift timbers in homes that had burned, and he joined the blacksmiths when their hammers rang out like music against fresh-forged steel. He passed through the city gates without escort, and when he was not in Minas Tirith, he rode into the countryside, meeting farmers, village elders, children who looked at him with awe. At night, he returned to the citadel, weary but content. Frodo had since departed from the White City, accompanied by his kin. The hobbits had lingered as long as they could, honoured and beloved, but the call of the Shire had grown louder in their hearts. Sam, especially, longed for the scent of tilled earth and the sound of bees. Aragorn had embraced each of them before they left, and when they passed beyond the city gates, it was with cheers and song and tears in equal measure. He missed them more than he expected. With their departure, something of the old world seemed to slip away. The world was changing, yes, but the innocence they carried, the quiet strength, the memory of their laughter, it stayed with him like the echo of a faraway bell. The city flourished in their absence. Embassies were established with the elves of Ithilien, and Legolas led many of his kin to dwell in its green borders, bringing with them the light of trees long vanished from the south. With Gimli came dwarves from Erebor and the glittering caves, and under their guidance the great gates of Minas Tirith were reforged, stronger and more beautiful than before. East and west, stone and leaf, came together in harmony as they never had in ages past. Aragorn presided over all this, not as a ruler above, but as a bridge between peoples. He wrote letters often, especially to Erestor and Elrond in Rivendell, requesting guidance in lore and lore. Though a king, he had not cast off the humility he had carried as a ranger. He governed with wisdom, but never assumed himself infallible, and it was in that very balance, strength and humility, that his people found their faith in him. And yet, even in the fullness of summer, one question remained in the hearts of many. When would the queen come? The days passed. The city watched. Aragorn said nothing of her arrival, nor did he speak often of his love for her. But his thoughts wandered frequently to the north, to Lothlorien, to the Silver Wood, to the golden boughs under which he had first seen Arwen Undomiel. Then, one morning in late summer, a rider arrived at the gate. She bore no heraldry, no proclamation, only a letter sealed with the sigil of the House of Elrond. Aragorn opened it in silence, and when he read its words, a light returned to his face that had long been hidden, like a flame sheltered against the wind. He rode alone that evening, leaving by the northern gate, riding swift as the gulls that traced the river's edge. He passed through the forests of Anórien and across the fields of Rohan, and when at last he reached the green borders of Lothlorien, he dismounted in silence and stood at the edge of the golden wood. And there she was, Arwen. She had changed little, though the world had turned. Her hair flowed like moonlit water, and her eyes still held the depth of ancient stars. She wore no crown, only a simple gown of midnight blue, but she stood as though born of legend, radiant and still. Neither spoke at first. Then slowly Aragorn walked to her. She met him halfway, and when their hands touched, the past, the waiting, the wandering, the sorrow of long years fell away like dust. They said nothing of what had been lost. They spoke only of what could now begin. Together they returned to Minas Tirith. The day of their wedding was marked not by grandeur, but by grace. The city was clothed in white and green. Banners of the tree and the star were raised beside the son of Rohan, and in the great square beneath the citadel, people from every corner of Middle-earth gathered. Men and dwarves, elves and hobbits, Southrons turned allies, Northmen with fur-lined cloaks, even a few of the wandering Drúdan. The ceremony was simple. Gandalf presided, his robes shining silver in the light, and when Aragorn and Arwen stood before the white tree hand in hand, their eyes locked in eternal promise, the city grew still. No horn sounded, no chorus sang. It was enough to see them. He, the returned king, weather-worn, eyes full of light and memory. She, the Evenstar, who had chosen a mortal life for love. Their vows were spoken in the old tongue, a language few remembered but all felt, and when they kissed, the sun broke fully from behind the clouds. Later, in the highest garden of the city, beneath lanterns of flame and blossom, the two sat in quiet peace, watching the stars. "Are you afraid?" Arwen asked softly. Aragorn turned to her. "Only of failing to deserve this." She smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "Then you already do." And below them, the city slept. At last, Gondor had both a king and queen. And in the hush of that summer night, wrapped in love and starlight, the Fourth Age truly began. The years that followed, the crowning of King Elessar and Queen Arwen, were gentle, like the hush that settles after a storm. The land, long starved of peace, exhaled. And under their reign, Gondor flourished, not with the thunder of conquest, but with the quiet resilience of things growing anew. Minas Tirith became once more the heart of a kingdom reborn. The scars of siege and fire faded, replaced by gardens, marble walkways and fountains that sang softly through the night. The white tree bloomed, its first buds small and tentative, but each spring brought fuller leaves, and with them joy that could not be forged or commanded. It bloomed as if the city itself had awakened. Aragorn ruled with a calm and patient hand. His court, though noble in bearing, was open to all. He heard disputes not only between lords, but between farmers and stonemasons, between sailors of the river and traders of the mountain paths. He listened, and more often than not, he sought understanding before judgment. Where other kings had built walls, Aragorn built bridges, literal and metaphorical. His counsels were wise, drawn from every corner of the realm. Faramir, now Prince of Ithilien, served at his right hand, guiding the restoration of the once wild land into a sanctuary of learning and growth. Éomer visited often from Rohan, bringing news of the Riddermark, and the two kings would ride together in the fields of Calenardon, laughing like brothers born of battle. Gimli returned to his people in Aglarond, the glittering caves, where he led a colony of dwarves in crafting halls of wonder beneath the mountains. And Legolas, ever drawn to the trees and starlight, began the work of nurturing the forests of Ithilien, bringing elves from the greenwood to dwell in harmony with the land. Together, they wove a quiet unity across the kingdoms. Never before had elf and dwarf, man and halfling, shared so many bonds, nor had the kingdoms of north and south spoken so freely. The scars left by the long dark were not erased, but they were no longer wounds, they were reminders. As for the hobbits, they had returned to the Shire, their journey westward marked by festivals and feasts in every village they passed. Aragorn had granted them lands in perpetuity, declaring the borders of the Shire protected and inviolate. The land of the little folk, he had called it, shall be free from the burden of kings. And so it was. He received word from them now and then. Letters came from Sam, often filled with details about his garden and his growing family. Merry wrote from Buckland, always sharing news of the borders. And Pippin's letters arrived accompanied by sketches, songs or recipes, each one more cheerful than the last. But Frodo's letters were fewer. They were kind, filled with love, but the ink grew more hesitant, the handwriting more delicate. Aragorn sensed what Gandalf had already understood. The ring had left a wound that would never fully heal. And though Frodo was honoured and beloved, he carried a quiet shadow. Aragorn thought of him often, especially on cool mornings when the wind came down from the north. Arwen, too, understood. Their love, deep as the sea and rooted like the mountains, became the quiet centre of the realm. She walked with him through the gardens in the evenings, spoke with the children of the city, and read often in the archives of Gondor's past. Her presence softened the edges of the court, and her laughter in the halls made even the most weathered captains smile. To Aragorn, she was not a symbol of elven grace or a prize earned through trial. She was simply Arwen, his light in the dark, his stillness amidst duty. In time, they had a son. He was named Eldarion, scion of elves and men. The day of his birth was marked with music from every balcony, from the deeping Coombe to the shores of Belfalas. And though he was but an infant, people saw in him the future, the promise of peace, not as a pause between wars, but as something enduring. Aragorn did not retreat into ceremony after his son's birth. He took him often on rides through the countryside, spoke to him in the elven tongue, and taught him stories of Númenor and the days of old. He held the child in the council chambers, unashamed to show his tenderness. He understood that kingship was not strength alone. It was inheritance, not just of crown, but of character. The Fourth Age deepened. Emissaries from distant lands came to pay tribute, not in fear, but in admiration. From Harad and Khand, new treaties were signed, not with swords at backs, but with open hands. The black ships that once bore death now brought spices, silks, and tales of their own peoples. Aragorn welcomed them all, seeking not to rule the world, but to understand it. He kept close the banner of the fellowship. Though scattered, they remained part of him. At the turn of each year, on the day the ring was destroyed, he climbed the tower of Ecthelion and stood in silence at sunrise. He spoke no words, but he remembered. Always. The memory of fire on Mount Doom, of a hobbit who did not yield, of another who carried him when all strength had gone, and of the weight they bore, so that others might walk in light. In those moments he was not the King of Gondor, nor the leader of men. He was simply Aragorn, son of Arathorn, a man who had walked the long road, not to glory, but to healing. As the years flowed on, the reign of King Elisar became legend in its own time. His wisdom shaped the laws of the realm, his justice echoed through the valleys of Gondor, and his kindness healed wounds that had lingered for generations. Peace settled over Middle-earth like a warm cloak, and though not every shadow was vanquished, the people of the West lived without fear of the dark. Aragorn aged slowly, as those of Númenórean blood do, years barely touching him at first. His hair remained dark, his stride sure, and his eyes bright with memory. He ruled into the 2nd century of the Fourth Age, guiding his people with steady hands, building friendships between once hostile lands, and restoring the legacy of Elendil, not as a king of war, but of peace. And yet, time could not be stayed forever. Even the long-lived feel its pull. As the days of his strength waned, Aragorn began to speak more often with Eldarion, his son, not with formality, but with care. He taught him the weight of silence, the art of mercy, the burden of decision. Eldarion learned not only how to hold a sword, but when to sheath it. He walked among the people of Gondor with the same quiet dignity that his father had worn like a second skin. Arwen watched all this with a gentle sadness. Her choice had been long made, her path irrevocable. She had given up the undying lands for love, and though she never spoke of sorrow, it rested in the corners of her eyes whenever she looked at Aragorn in sleep or silence. She had counted the cost, and she bore it gladly. But the immortal heart in her still ached at the passing of time. Then came the winter of his final year. The leaves in the City of Kings turned gold, and the wind carried the scent of stillness. Aragorn knew. He felt it not in pain, but in the deep weariness of one who has fulfilled every vow, who has fought the long fight, and now sees the road ahead turning toward mist. He called his family to him. Eldarion, tall and wise beyond his years. Arwen, still fair beyond mortal reckoning, though sorrow lay in her every breath. And he laid aside the crown. He said farewell to his captains, to Faramir, whose loyalty had never faltered, to Legolas, who had come from Ithilien in silence and now stood by his side once more, to Gimli, older now, beard silvered, who wept not with noise but with quiet dignity. And at last he lay in the House of Kings, on the bed of rest prepared for him, with Andoril at his side and white lilies scattered around his feet. Arwen knelt beside him. "There is nothing more I would have asked of this world," he said to her, voice a whisper, "except more time to walk beside you." She held his hand. "Then we have had more than most." He smiled faintly. "I am glad you chose life, Evenstar, for you made mine more than I deserved." And with a final breath, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elessar Telcontar, the High King of Gondor and Arnor, closed his eyes and was still. The kingdom mourned. Bells rang across the land, from the towers of Minas Tirith to the halls of Edoras. In the far north, the Dúnedain lit lanterns in his honour. In the south, ships dipped their sails in silence. In the Shire, Samwise stood by the party tree and whispered a prayer to the west wind. Aragorn was laid to rest in the House of Kings upon Mount Mindoluin, beneath a stone carved with stars and the words in Quenya, "Elessar, Elendil's heir, who bore the flame of the west." Arwen did not remain in the city. She left without escort, clothed in grey, walking alone into the fading woods of Lorien, now nearly abandoned. There, among the golden leaves of her youth, she lay beneath the Malorn trees and let the world pass from her. Her spirit, though bound to mortality, was quiet, and the forest kept her in its memory. Years became decades. Gondor endured. The white tree continued to bloom. Eldarion ruled wisely, carrying his father's memory not as a burden, but as a light to guide the future. Peace did not last forever, as peace never does, but neither did it fade quickly. The foundation Aragorn had laid held strong, and in stories passed down, in tapestries and songs, in the hush of libraries and the laughter of children, his name lived on. Not only as king, but as hope. Hope that had walked through fire, hope that had risen from ruin, hope that had kept its promise. And somewhere in the memory of Middle-earth, beneath stars, beneath trees, beneath the long hush of time, Aragorn still walked, tall and quiet, with the Evenstar at his side.